Welcome, fellow wanderers of the endless seas, to the shadows that lurk beneath One Piece's eternal sunshine. Tonight, we journey into the darkness that Oda has woven through his grand tapestry, moments where horror seeps through the cracks of adventure, where the grotesque dwells alongside the heroic. These are the tales that remind us that even in a world of dreams and determination, nightmares can take root in the most unexpected places. So settle in. Let the gentle rhythm of ocean waves carry you toward peaceful slumber as we explore the most disturbing, unsettling, and genuinely terrifying moments that have emerged from the Grand Line's deepest waters. The shadows that danced across Thriller Gothic architecture seemed almost benign compared to the true horrors that festered within its walls, where death had been transformed from natural conclusion into grotesque entertainment. This floating fortress of the macabre served as testament to humanity's capacity for perverting even the most sacred boundaries, turning love into obsession, medicine into torture, and the very concept of eternal rest into an endless nightmare of servitude. In the deepest chambers of Hogback's laboratory, where the stench of formaldehyde mingled with the sweet decay of roses, the most disturbing love story ever conceived played out night after night. Dr. Hogback, once regarded as one of the world's most brilliant surgeons, had allowed his professional dedication to curdle into something far more sinister. His hands, which had once saved lives with their precision and skill, now violated the sanctity of death itself in pursuit of desires that no living person could fulfill. Victoria Sindri had been everything that the world celebrated in feminine beauty and artistic talent, her performances on stage drawing audiences from across the Grand Line who came to witness grace made manifest in human form. She moved through her roles with an elegance that seemed to transcend mere acting, her voice carrying emotional depths that could move the hardest hearts to tears, her presence commanding attention from the moment she stepped into the spotlight until long after the curtains fell. For Dr. Hogback, who served as her personal physician, these qualities became sources of obsession rather than professional appreciation. His medical training had taught him to observe the human body with clinical detachment, to view patients as collections of systems requiring repair rather than individuals deserving respect. But with Sindri, this professional distance collapsed entirely, replaced by fixations that grew more consuming with each appointment, each examination, each moment spent in her presence. The proposal he eventually made carried none of the romantic sincerity that such declarations were supposed to embody, but rather the desperate hunger of someone who had confused possession with love, who saw in marriage not partnership, but ownership of something precious that he feared losing to others. His inability to comprehend her gentle refusal to accept that her heart belonged to another revealed the fundamental hollowness at the core of his character, the way his brilliant mind had been corrupted by entitlement that recognized no authority beyond his own desires. When death claimed Sindri through what should have been a minor accident, the fall from her stage that snapped her neck with surgical precision, Hogback faced the same choice that confronts everyone who loses someone they love: acceptance of loss or rejection of reality itself. The path he chose led him deep into territories that no ethical physician should ever explore, places where the Hippocratic Oath became meaningless scripture and human dignity dissolved into raw materials for experimentation. The collaboration with Gecko Moria that followed was born not of shared goals, but of mutual necessity, the warlord's shadow fruit, providing exactly the tools that Hogback needed to achieve violations of natural law that medical science alone could never accomplish. Together, they created a system of resurrection that mocked every culture's understanding of what death meant, turning final rest into the beginning of a new kind of suffering that had no precedent in human experience. The process of transforming Sindri's corpse into a functional zombie required modifications that went far beyond simple reanimation, surgical alterations that served Hogback's twisted aesthetic preferences rather than any practical necessity. He carved away pieces of her that reminded him of her independence, replaced aspects of her personality with mechanical responses that better suited his fantasies, and installed behavioral modifications that ensured her compliance with demands that living Sindri would never have entertained. The wedding dress that adorned zombie Sindri during their grotesque ceremonies carried implications that extended far beyond mere costume, its white fabric serving as symbol of purity that had been forever corrupted, innocence transformed into something that served darker purposes. The veil that covered her face hid expressions of horror that occasionally broke through her programmed obedience, moments when some fragment of her original consciousness surfaced long enough to recognize what had been done to her. These glimpses of awareness represented perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Hogback's crime, the evidence that some part of Sindri remained trapped within her reanimated flesh, forced to observe her own violation without possessing the power to resist or escape. Her tears, when they occasionally fell during moments of overwhelming realization, spoke to depths of psychological torture that living humans could barely comprehend. The awareness of being used in ways that contradicted every value she had held dear. The domestic routine that Hogback established with his zombie bride revealed the thoroughness of his delusions, the way he had constructed elaborate justifications for actions that any rational observer would recognize as systematic abuse of the most vulnerable kind. He spoke to her as if she were a willing participant in their relationship, interpreted her programmed responses as genuine affection, and convinced himself that he had achieved the happiness that had been denied to him by her living self's refusal. The laboratory where he conducted his ongoing experiments served as monument to the ways that scientific knowledge could be corrupted when separated from ethical constraints, each preserved specimen representing another violation of dignity that he justified through appeals to advancement and discovery. The bodies that lined his walls had once been people with names, families, dreams, and fears, reduced now to resources for projects that served no purpose, beyond satisfying the twisted curiosities of someone who had forgotten what it meant to be human. But Hogback's violations were not limited to the realm of medicine, extending into territories that combined physical horror with psychological manipulation in ways that created entirely new categories of suffering. The modifications he made to Absalom, transforming a relatively ordinary man into something that could violate privacy with supernatural efficiency, demonstrated his willingness to create tools for evil that went far beyond his own personal obsessions. Absalom emerged from Hogback's surgical theater as a walking embodiment of every woman's worst fears about male predation, his invisibility, allowing him to invade spaces where consent could never be given, because victims remained unaware of his presence. The scenes that followed his transformation revealed the full scope of horror that could be achieved when voyeuristic impulses were combined with supernatural ability, creating situations where even the most basic assumptions about personal safety became meaningless. The bathhouse where Nami attempted to cleanse herself of the day's adventures became a theater of violation where traditional barriers between public and private dissolved, her nakedness observed by eyes she could neither see nor escape. The psychological weight of such intrusion, the knowledge that intimate moments had been stolen without permission, created trauma that extended far beyond the immediate physical threat, poisoning the very concept of sanctuary with awareness that nowhere was truly safe. The forced wedding ceremony that Absalom orchestrated represented the logical culmination of his predatory evolution, the transformation of religious ritual into theater of possession, where sacred vows became tools of psychological torture. The white dress that adorned his unconscious bride carried the same symbolic weight as Sindri's eternal wedding gown, innocence perverted into costume for performances that served only to satisfy the twisted needs of those who had forgotten how to distinguish between love and ownership. The delusional psychology required to stage such ceremonies, to believe that unconscious participation constituted genuine consent, revealed depths of mental distortion that made reasoning with such individuals impossible. Absalom's inability to comprehend why his victims might object to his attentions spoke to fundamental breaks in his understanding of human relationships. The way his surgical modifications had been accompanied by psychological changes that rendered him incapable of recognizing other people as autonomous beings deserving of respect. The zombie animals that populated Thriller Bark served as grotesque parody of Noah's Ark. Two of every species, preserved not for salvation but for entertainment, their natural behaviors, warped by reanimation, into performances that served their master's amusement rather than their own instincts. The sight of creatures that should have been at rest centuries ago shambling through performances of life created uncanny valley effects that disturbed even hardened pirates accustomed to supernatural phenomena. Yet perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of Thriller Bark's horrors lay not in its grotesque displays, but in its systematic destruction of concepts that most people required for basic psychological stability. The idea that death provided final rest, that privacy could be maintained through reasonable precautions, that religious ceremonies carried sacred meaning that could not be corrupted. All of these assumptions were systematically demolished through examples that proved their vulnerability to sufficient malice and creativity. The liberation that came when Luffy and his crew finally brought justice to this floating monument to violation felt like more than simple victory over enemies, representing restoration of natural order to a place where fundamental boundaries had been erased through systematic perversion. The collapse of Hogback's delusions, the destruction of his laboratory, and the final rest granted to those who had been denied it, provided closure not just for immediate victims, but for universal human need to believe that some things remained sacred, even in a world where power could corrupt absolutely. The lessons that emerged from Thriller Bark's defeat extended far beyond the immediate tactical considerations of pirate warfare, touching upon essential questions about the nature of consent, the responsibilities that came with medical knowledge, and the ways that isolation could transform brilliant minds into instruments of unspeakable evil. The warning embedded within Hogback's fall served as a reminder that expertise without empathy, knowledge without compassion, and power without accountability inevitably led to places where even the most basic human dignities could be sacrificed in service of desires that should never have been allowed to flourish. As the Thousand Sunny sailed away from the wreckage of Thriller Bark, carrying with it the crew members who had confronted horrors that would haunt their dreams for years to come, the ocean itself seemed to exhale in relief that such violations of natural law had finally been brought to an end. The zombies who had been granted final rest, the shadows that had been returned to their rightful owners, and the countless victims of Hogback's experiments who could finally know peace served as testament to the importance of those who stood against such systematic evil. No matter how overwhelming the darkness might initially appear, the scars left by encounters with true horror never fully faded, but they served purposes beyond mere trauma, reminding those who bore them of the precious value of normal human dignity, the courage required to protect the vulnerable, and the eternal vigilance necessary to ensure that brilliant minds remain servants of humanity rather than its predators. In facing the worst that human imagination could conceive, heroes discovered not just their own strength, but their responsibility to ensure that such nightmares remained forever confined to the realm of defeated memory, rather than living reality. In the hallowed halls of Marie-Choix, where the world's fate was decided with the casual indifference of gods selecting which mortals deserved continued existence, Im sat upon the empty throne that officially belonged to no one while secretly commanding everything. The figure whose very name remained unknown to most of the world wielded power so absolute that entire civilizations could be erased with less consideration than most people gave to choosing breakfast. This was not the theatrical evil of pirates who announced their intentions with black flags and dramatic speeches, but something far more terrifying. The banality of systematic extermination dressed in the bureaucratic language of necessary sacrifice. The selection of Lelouchia Kingdom for annihilation began not with careful strategic analysis or urgent security concerns, but with the kind of administrative efficiency that characterized the world government's approach to maintaining global stability. When subordinates approached Im, with maps spread across marble tables, pointing to various nations that had shown signs of revolutionary sympathy, the response came with chilling simplicity. No lengthy deliberations about civilian casualties, no consideration of diplomatic alternatives, no acknowledgement that millions of lives hung in the balance of this decision. The reasoning behind Lelouchia's destruction revealed depths of moral bankruptcy that even seasoned observers of world government policy found difficult to comprehend. This was not a nation that posed immediate military threat, not a kingdom harboring dangerous criminals or developing prohibited weapons. These were farmers whose greatest crime had been providing aid to refugees, fishermen whose boats had never ventured beyond their own territorial waters, children whose only knowledge of the outside world came from picture books and travelers' tales. When pressed for justification of this particular target, Im's response carried the weight of absolute authority, unconcerned with external judgment or internal consistency. Lelouchia was chosen not because it represented unique danger or strategic importance, but simply because its location made it convenient for demonstration purposes. The casual nature of this selection process, the reduction of human civilization to problems of logistics and proximity, revealed how completely the world government had divorced itself from any recognition of individual human worth. The ancient weapon that descended from the skies above Lelouchia operated according to principles that made conventional warfare seem quaint by comparison. Its destructive capacity so overwhelming that resistance became not just futile but incomprehensible. The light that preceded obliteration was beautiful in its way, a celestial radiance that might have inspired awe in different circumstances, but which instead served as herald for annihilation so complete that it left no trace of what had come before. The citizens of Lelouchia, who looked up at this approaching radiance, experienced the kind of existential terror that most humans never encounter. The certain knowledge that death was approaching with mathematical precision, that no amount of prayer or courage or cleverness could alter what was about to occur. Some tried to run, their legs carrying them across familiar streets that would cease to exist within moments, their minds unable to process the futility of seeking escape from destruction that operated on scales beyond human comprehension. Families gathering their children close in final moments of desperate protection. Parents attempting to shield young eyes from sights that no preparation could have made bearable. Couples holding hands as their world dissolved around them. These scenes of intimate human connection, in the face of cosmic indifference, provided stark contrast to the clinical efficiency with which their extinction was administered. The love that persisted even in these final seconds served as testament to qualities that Im's system of governance could never understand or account for in its calculations. The agricultural terraces that had fed Lelouchia's population for generations, carved into hillsides by ancestors who had planned for futures that would never arrive, disappeared alongside the people who had tended them with care, passed down through centuries of patient cultivation. the schools where children had learned to read and write, the hospitals where healers had dedicated their lives to preserving others, the workshops where artisans had created beauty from raw materials, all of it reduced to atoms scattered across an ocean that would carry no memory of what had been lost. The completeness of Lulusia's erasure extended beyond mere physical destruction to encompass the systematic elimination of historical record, the deletion of evidence that these people had ever existed at all. Maps were reprinted with empty ocean where an island had once flourished. Census records were adjusted to remove populations that could no longer be counted. Trade agreements were cancelled with notation that the other party had ceased to exist. This methodical approach to erasing not just lives but memories revealed the world government's understanding that true power lay not merely in the ability to kill, but in the capacity to make it as if victims had never lived at all. The psychological impact on survivors who remembered Lulusia, the traders who had visited its markets, the diplomats who had negotiated with its representatives, the children who had pen pals among its students, created a special kind of trauma born from having their memories invalidated by official reality. The precedent established by Lulusia's destruction rippled across the world in ways that Im had certainly intended. Every kingdom and revolutionary cell now forced to confront the reality that geography alone could determine their fate. The message was clear and comprehensive. Opposition to world government authority would be met, not with proportional response or even brutal suppression, but with total obliteration that extended to erasure from history itself. Other rulers found themselves studying maps with new appreciation for their proximity to strategic targets, calculating whether their locations made them convenient examples for future demonstrations of Im's power. The randomness that had characterized Lulusia's selection made every nation equally vulnerable, creating paranoia that served the world government's interests far more effectively than any targeted threats could have achieved. The parallel between Lulusia's fate and the destruction of O'Hara 20 years earlier revealed patterns in world government methodology that suggested systematic refinement of genocidal techniques, each atrocity building upon lessons learned from previous massacres. Where O'Hara's destruction had required deployment of marine fleets and involved messy cleanup operations that left inconvenient witnesses, Lulusia's annihilation achieved the same goals with clinical efficiency that left no evidence for future investigators to discover. Robin's childhood trauma took on new dimensions when viewed in light of Im's casual approach to civilizational erasure, her survival representing not miraculous escape, but temporary oversight in a system that had since been perfected to eliminate such loose ends. The scholars who had thrown their books into O'Hara's lake in desperate attempts to preserve knowledge had acted from understanding that their deaths were inevitable, but their sacrifice might still serve some purpose in preserving truth for future generations. The knowledge that those scholars had died to protect, the true history of the Void Century, and the circumstances surrounding the world government's founding took on urgency that transcended academic curiosity when viewed against Im's demonstrated willingness to commit genocide for administrative convenience. If entire civilizations could be eliminated to prevent inconvenient questions about the past, then the secrets buried in that historical gap must carry implications that threaten the very foundations of the current world order. The poneglyphs scattered across the world gain new significance as repositories of information that someone had considered worth preserving, despite centuries of systematic suppression, their indestructible nature serving as hedge against the kind of total erasure that had claimed both O'Hara and Lulusia. The ancient language carved into these stones represented not just historical curiosity but active resistance to a system that maintained power through control of information and elimination of inconvenient truths. The scholars of Ohara who had dedicated their lives to deciphering these ancient texts had understood something that Im's regime could never tolerate, that knowledge once released could never be fully contained. That truth had viral properties that allowed it to spread and reproduce despite the most sophisticated attempts at suppression. Their deaths had been necessary not because their research posed immediate military threat, but because it challenged the fundamental lies upon which 800 years of world government authority had been constructed. The psychological profile that emerged from Im's actions suggested someone who had transcended normal human categories of good and evil to achieve something far more disturbing: complete detachment from the moral frameworks that most people used to evaluate their choices. This was not malice in any conventional sense, but rather the kind of utilitarian calculation that reduced human suffering to statistical abstractions that could be weighed against strategic advantages without emotional interference. The courtiers and administrators who carried out Im's directives had learned to think in similar terms, their language filled with euphemisms that transformed mass murder into policy implementation, genocide into strategic necessity. The bureaucratic machinery that made such crimes possible operated through chains of responsibility so diffuse that individual participants could avoid confronting the full horror of what their coordination achieved. Yet even within this system of distributed culpability, certain individuals bore responsibility that could not be minimized through appeals to following orders or serving greater good. The Marine officers who had implemented Ohara's destruction, the CP agents who had tracked Robin through her childhood, the government officials who had authorized Lulusia's targeting, all had made choices that prioritized career advancement and institutional loyalty over recognition of basic human dignity. The long-term consequences of Im's approach to governance extended far beyond the immediate victims of these atrocities, creating ripple effects that would shape global politics for generations to come. Every revolutionary movement that emerged in response to world government oppression carried within it the seeds of future conflicts that might dwarf anything the world had previously witnessed, the accumulated grievances of centuries of systematic abuse, creating pressure that no amount of force could permanently contain. The true horror of Im's regime lay not in any single act of destruction, however massive, but in the systematic normalization of atrocity that transformed exceptional evil into routine administrative procedure. When genocide became bureaucratic process, when erasure of entire civilizations could be accomplished with paperwork and targeting coordinates, when human lives counted for less than convenience in site selection, then the very concept of individual worth had been eliminated as effectively as any physical target. The ocean that now covered the space where Lulusia had flourished would continue to carry waves across empty coordinates for millennia to come, its waters bearing no trace of the voices that had once called it home, no echo of the laughter that had once filled its streets, no memory of the dreams that had once shaped its future. In this vast liquid grave, unmarked and unmourned by any official ceremony, lay proof that even in a world of impossible powers and supernatural abilities, the greatest horrors remained distinctly human in their origins and implications. The island of Whole Cake stretched across the horizon like a confectionery nightmare, its pastel towers and candy-coated architecture concealing horrors that would have made even the most hardened pirates reconsider their career choices. At the heart of this sugar-sweet dystopia ruled Charlotte Linlin, known to the world as Big Mom, whose childlike appearance and seemingly innocent obsessions masked a capacity for casual cruelty that defied comprehension. Her empire was built not on the traditional pirate foundation of strength and intimidation, but on something far more disturbing: the weaponization of maternal instincts twisted into instruments of absolute control. The birthday party that had defined Linlin's 6th year remained the most significant day in her life, though she herself retained no conscious memory of what had transpired during those crucial hours when hunger had transformed an innocent celebration into an act of cannibalism so complete that it defied rational analysis. The other children of Mother Caramel's orphanage had gathered to celebrate their largest and strongest member, their voices raised in songs of joy that would be silenced forever before the day's end. Mother Caramel herself had orchestrated the celebration with the careful attention to detail that characterized all her interactions with the children under her care, though her true motivations remained hidden beneath layers of deception that even decades later had not been fully unraveled. The semla that served as centerpiece for the celebration had been prepared according to traditional recipes that called for ingredients both sweet and substantial, each pastry crafted to provide maximum satisfaction for a child whose appetite had already begun to exceed normal human parameters. The transformation that occurred during the consumption of these treats revealed aspects of Linlin's nature that even she had not suspected existed, her devil fruit powers manifesting in ways that bypassed conscious control to operate according to instincts far more primitive than rational thought. The joy that accompanied her eating gradually escalated into something approaching religious ecstasy, her eyes filling with tears of happiness as flavors exploded across her palate, in combinations that seemed to unlock previously unknown centers of pleasure in her developing brain. The other children watched this display with the mixture of fascination and concern that characterized most observers of Linlin's more extreme behaviors, their initial encouragement gradually giving way to unease, as her consumption continued far beyond what should have been physically possible, their voices calling her name, their attempts to gain her attention, their growing alarm as she showed no signs of stopping. All of these sounds became background noise to someone whose entire consciousness had narrowed to the singular focus of satisfying hunger that seemed to grow larger rather than smaller with each bite consumed. The line between food and flesh became meaningless during those crucial moments when Linlin's awareness of her surroundings faded to nothing, her hands reaching for whatever lay within grasp, without distinguishing between semla and the fingers that might have been offering it. The other children's attempts to help serve the pastries brought them within range of someone whose appetite had transcended normal categories to become a force of nature, operating according to its own terrible logic. Mother Caramel's final moments were spent not in horror at what was occurring, but in satisfaction that her carefully laid plans had finally reached their intended conclusion, her true identity as a government agent and child trafficker finally irrelevant in the face of forces that she had helped unleash but could no longer control. The irony that she would be consumed by the very weapon she had been grooming for sale to the world government provided fitting conclusion to a life spent manipulating children's trust for purposes they could never have comprehended. The acquisition of the soul fruit's powers through this act of inadvertent cannibalism established patterns that would define the rest of Linlin's existence, her devil fruit abilities growing stronger through consumption of the very person who had previously wielded them. The process by which devil fruit powers transferred from victim to consumer remained mysterious even to the world's most accomplished scholars, but the results in this case were undeniable. Linlin emerged from her feeding frenzy with capabilities that exceeded anything she had previously demonstrated. The isolation that followed this traumatic event served to reinforce the psychological damage that such an experience would inflict on any developing mind. Her fellow orphans and caretaker having vanished without explanation, while she remained alone in a facility designed to house dozens of children. The silence that replaced voices she had known since infancy created the first of many voids in her emotional development that would never be adequately filled, leaving her with hunger not just for food, but for the sounds of life that had once surrounded her. The narrative that Linlin constructed to explain the disappearance of everyone she had cared about revealed the depth of psychological protection that her mind had erected against memories too traumatic to consciously process. Her conviction that Mother, Caramel, and the other children had simply vanished during her moment of greatest happiness allowed her to preserve some sense of innocence while avoiding confrontation with actions that would have shattered any remaining faith in her own goodness. The decades that followed saw these repressed memories manifest in increasingly disturbing ways. Her treatment of her own children, reflecting unconscious attempts to recreate the family structure that she had destroyed without ever acknowledging her role in its destruction. The birthday celebrations that she demanded from her subjects carried undertones of desperate attempts to recapture the joy of that final meal. Her insistence on elaborate parties, serving as ritualistic reenactment of the day when everything had gone wrong. The homies that populated her territory represented externalization of her desire to be surrounded by living beings who could never abandon her, souls extracted from unwilling donors and imprisoned in inanimate objects that would provide companionship without the risk of voluntary departure. The anthropomorphic furniture, clothing, and food that filled her castle served as grotesque parody of the childhood she remembered. Animated objects, providing simulation of friendship without the emotional complexity that had made her original relationships so precious. Her treatment of her biological children revealed the impossibility of genuine maternal love from someone whose understanding of family had been fundamentally corrupted by trauma she refused to acknowledge. The political marriages she arranged treated her offspring as resources to be deployed in pursuit of territorial expansion, their individual desires and happiness subordinated to strategic considerations that served her vision of empire building through genetic networking. The soul ripping that she employed as casual punishment for minor infractions demonstrated how completely she had dissociated from normal human empathy. Her son Moscato's life force extracted and consumed without hesitation when his attempts to calm her hunger tantrum inconvenienced her immediate desires. The ease with which she committed what amounted to murder of her own child suggested that somewhere in her subconscious mind, the distinction between people and food had never been fully re-established after that traumatic 6th birthday. The hunger pangs that periodically seized control of her consciousness represented return of the same dissociative state that had characterized her original cannibalistic episode. Her rational mind temporarily overwhelmed by appetites that operated according to their own internal logic. During these episodes, anyone unfortunate enough to be in her vicinity became potential targets for violence that bore no relationship to their actions or her normal feelings toward them. The wedding cake that eventually provided resolution to one of these hunger fits revealed both the temporary nature of such solutions and the fundamental emptiness that drove her compulsive eating, each satisfied craving followed inevitably by new hunger that demanded ever more elaborate satisfaction. The cycle of appetite and consumption that defined her existence could never be permanently resolved because it was driven not by physiological needs, but by psychological wounds that food could temporarily distract from, but never heal. The citizens of Whole Cake Island who lived under her protection found themselves trapped in relationships that combined genuine care with casual brutality, their lives subject to termination based on factors entirely beyond their control. The monthly soul tax that she demanded from residents served as a reminder that their continued existence depended on her ongoing satisfaction with their contributions to her empire, their life forces literally fueling the fantasy world she had constructed around her damaged psyche. The three-eyed tribe members who served her regime possessed abilities that might have unlocked the secrets of the ancient past. Their potential for reading poneglyphs, representing keys to historical knowledge, that could reshape understanding of the world's foundations. The fact that she valued these individuals primarily as breeding stock for future generations demonstrated her fundamental inability to recognize the full humanity of anyone whose capabilities served her strategic interests. The mirror world that served as infrastructure for her surveillance network created panopticon conditions where privacy became impossible and every citizen existed under constant observation by forces loyal to someone whose moods could shift from benevolent to homicidal without warning. The psychological pressure of life under such scrutiny inevitably warped the behavior of subjects who could never relax their guard or express genuine emotions that might be interpreted as disloyalty. The libraries of stolen memories that her regime maintained represented systematic violation of individual identity on scales that exceeded even the world government's most invasive intelligence operations. People's personal histories extracted and archived for purposes that served Big Mom's paranoid need to control every aspect of her subjects' inner lives. The ability to alter or erase memories meant that citizens could never be certain whether their own thoughts and feelings were genuine or artificial constructs implanted for someone else's convenience. Pudding's three-eyed heritage and memory manipulation abilities made her both invaluable asset and tragic victim of a system that reduced individual worth to utilitarian calculations. Her potential for reading ancient texts, overshadowed by her utility as tool for psychological warfare against enemies who threatened her mother's power. The surgery that had been performed on her third eye represented an attempt to enhance natural abilities through artificial means, regardless of the trauma such procedures might inflict on a developing child. The wedding ceremony that was meant to cement political alliance between the Charlotte and Vinsmoke families served as theater for assassination plot that revealed the depths of Big Mom's willingness to betray even formal agreements when doing so served her territorial ambitions. The fact that she planned mass murder during what should have been celebration of unity demonstrated how completely she had abandoned normal concepts of honor and good faith in favor of naked pursuit of advantage. The psychological warfare that accompanied this betrayal involved manipulation of romantic feelings that Pudding had been encouraged to develop toward her intended husband, her genuine emotions weaponized against targets who had no way of recognizing the layers of deception that surrounded every aspect of their interactions. The cruelty involved in using a young woman's capacity for love as instrument of destruction spoke to systematic corruption of natural human impulses that characterized Big Mom's approach to governance. The seducing woods that surrounded her territory operated according to principles that trapped visitors in psychological mazes designed to disorient and exhaust those who attempted unauthorized entry, the very landscape serving as extension of her paranoid need to control access to her domain. The trees themselves possessed souls extracted from previous intruders, their consciousness imprisoned in wooden forms that served as eternal sentries, warning others away from paths that led toward freedom. The recovery from her eating disorder episodes revealed the temporary nature of any solution to psychological wounds that remained unacknowledged and untreated. Each period of calm inevitably followed by return of symptoms that grew more severe as her underlying trauma remained unresolved. The wedding cake that had provided relief during the Whole Cake Island incident served only to delay rather than prevent future hunger pangs that would threaten anyone unfortunate enough to be nearby when her next episode occurred. The legacy of that 6th birthday party continued to shape every aspect of Big Mom's existence, from her empire-building strategies to her treatment of family members, from her dietary habits to her sleeping arrangements, creating ripple effects that had claimed thousands of lives over the decades, while leaving the original perpetrator blissfully unaware of the connections between past trauma and present cruelty. The little girl who had eaten her family had grown into an emperor whose appetite remained forever unsatisfied, whose hunger could never be filled, because it was driven not by physical need, but by emotional voids that food could never fill, leaving her trapped in cycles of consumption and violence that would continue until someone possessed sufficient strength and wisdom to break the patterns that trauma had established in her developing mind. The golden threads that danced through the air around Don Quixote do Flamingo carried within them the accumulated weight of centuries of noble privilege corrupted into instruments of absolute tyranny, each strand serving as conduit for a will so twisted by childhood trauma that it had transformed a potentially redeemable soul into something that reveled in the systematic destruction of everything that most people held sacred. His story began not with inherent evil, but with the kind of idealistic naivety that his father had mistaken for nobility, a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature that would doom an entire family to consequences that none of them could have anticipated. Don Quixote Homing's decision to renounce his family's celestial dragon status represented the kind of moral courage that should have been celebrated as pinnacle of human ethical development, yet his inability to comprehend the practical implications of such principled stands revealed dangerous gaps between intention and wisdom. His belief that simply abandoning privilege would automatically grant his family acceptance among normal humans demonstrated the profound isolation in which world nobles existed, their understanding of ordinary life so distorted by centuries of artificial elevation that they could not grasp how deeply their very existence was resented by those they had oppressed. The house in the North Blue where the Don Quixote family attempted to establish their new life became a laboratory for testing whether good intentions could overcome historical grievances, whether individual acts of renunciation could erase collective memories of systematic abuse. The neighbors who surrounded them carried within their hearts generations of stories about celestial dragon cruelty, tales of families destroyed by noble whim, of children sold into slavery to satisfy aristocratic entertainment, of entire communities raised to provide construction materials for palaces that most humans would never be permitted to glimpse. The discovery of their true identity by the local population triggered responses that had been building in intensity for centuries. The opportunity to inflict suffering upon former oppressors proving too tempting for people whose own lives had been shaped by injustices that they had never been permitted to address directly. The mob that eventually surrounded the Don Quixote home was composed not of inherently evil individuals, but of ordinary people whose capacity for mercy had been exhausted by lifetimes of witnessing systematic cruelty that went unpunished and unacknowledged. Young Doflamingo and his brother Rocinante found themselves thrust into situations that no child should ever experience, their protected upbringing having provided no preparation for the reality of being hated, not for their personal actions, but for the sins of ancestors whose crimes had been so comprehensive that they stained every subsequent generation. The confusion and terror that accompanied their first encounters with genuine violence created psychological wounds that would never fully heal. Their developing minds, struggling to process experiences that challenged every assumption they had been taught about their place in the world. The crucifixion that served as the mob's ultimate expression of righteous anger was designed not merely to kill, but to maximize suffering. The symbolic significance of the execution method chosen specifically to mirror the kind of theatrical cruelty that celestial dragons had historically employed against those who inconvenienced them. The wood against which the family was bound had been soaked in substances that would burn slowly when ignited, ensuring prolonged agony that would satisfy the crowd's desire for proportional justice. The arrows that pierced 8-year-old Doflamingo's flesh were fired not by professional soldiers trained to kill efficiently, but by ordinary citizens, whose accuracy varied according to their individual levels of rage and intoxication creating wounds that were randomly distributed across his small body, according to no pattern except the anarchic geometry of mob violence. The eye that was destroyed during this assault became a permanent reminder of the day when his understanding of the world shifted from naive optimism to paranoid certainty that everyone was potential enemy. The psychological transformation that occurred during these hours of torture was as complete as any devil fruit metamorphosis. The child who had once played innocent games, replaced by someone whose entire worldview had been rebuilt around principles of preemptive cruelty and systematic domination. The pain that racked his body served as catalyst for insights about power dynamics that most people spent lifetimes avoiding, the recognition that mercy was luxury, that only the strong could afford, and that weakness invariably led to victimization. His father's pleas for understanding and forgiveness during these final moments represented everything that Doflamingo would spend the rest of his life rejecting. The old man's continued faith in human goodness, seeming like dangerous delusion in light of evidence that surrounded them. The idealism that had motivated their family's renunciation of privilege became, in his developing mind, the primary cause of their current suffering, proof that moral principles were tools that the naive used to destroy themselves. Rocinante's different response to the same trauma revealed the arbitrary nature of how extreme experiences shaped developing personalities, his brother's pain channeling itself into empathy and determination to prevent others from suffering similar fates. The divergent paths that the brothers would eventually follow demonstrated that shared experiences did not guarantee similar outcomes, that individual choices retained significance, even when made under the most constraining circumstances. The rescue that eventually freed them from immediate death did not free them from the psychological consequences of what they had endured, their liberation coming too late to prevent damage that would influence every subsequent decision they made. The years that followed were spent not in recovery but in elaborating upon lessons learned during those crucial hours when childhood ended and something far darker began. Doflamingo's eventual acquisition of devil fruit powers provided him with tools perfectly suited to his evolved understanding of human relationships. The string fruit's abilities allowing him to exercise the kind of absolute control that he had concluded was necessary for survival in a world where everyone was potential threat. The invisible threads that he could produce and manipulate served as perfect metaphor for the puppet master mentality that governed his approach to leadership, his subjects valuable only insofar as they could be made to dance according to his choreography. The Dressrosa that he eventually conquered represented everything that his traumatic childhood had taught him to despise. A kingdom where people lived in relative peace and prosperity, where trust between rulers and subjects created stability that seemed to mock the paranoid vigilance that his own experiences had taught him was necessary for survival. The very existence of such a place challenged his core beliefs about human nature, suggesting that perhaps his father's idealistic visions had not been entirely delusional. King Riku's gentle rule over his subjects provided living contradiction to Doflamingo's conviction that power could only be maintained through fear and systematic oppression, the old monarch's popularity and effectiveness serving as constant reminder that alternative approaches to governance were possible. The threat that such examples posed to Doflamingo's psychological stability was far greater than any military challenge could have been, forcing him to confront possibilities that his traumatized mind could not afford to acknowledge. The ultimatum that he presented to King Riku was designed not merely to transfer power, but to systematically destroy the moral foundations upon which the kingdom's prosperity had been built. The demand for 10 billion berries calculated to be impossible to meet through any legitimate means. The psychological cruelty involved in forcing a beloved ruler to beg his own people for money that they could not afford demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of human dignity that Doflamingo had developed during his years of planning revenge against a world that had wounded him. The citizens of Dressrosa, who emptied their savings to help their king meet this impossible demand, demonstrated exactly the kind of trust and mutual loyalty that Doflamingo's worldview insisted could not exist. Their willingness to sacrifice personal security for collective good, challenging every assumption upon which his philosophy of governance was based. Their generosity became a weapon that he could use against them, proof of the dangerous naivety that his own family's fate had illustrated so dramatically. The string parasites that allowed him to control King Riku's body during the massacre that followed represented the ultimate expression of his childhood trauma, transformed into instrument of systematic revenge, forcing his victim to experience the same kind of helpless horror that he had felt while crucified and pierced by arrows. The psychological torture involved in being forced to murder one's own subjects exceeded even the physical agony that Doflamingo had endured, creating suffering that was precisely calibrated to match his memories of ultimate betrayal. The children who died during this orchestrated slaughter were approximately the same age that he had been during his own traumatic awakening, their death serving as offering to the part of him that had been killed during those hours of crucifixion and torture. Each life extinguished represented vengeance against the innocence that he had been forced to abandon, proof that the world contained no sanctuary that could protect the vulnerable from consequences of their elders' choices. The decade of rule that followed this bloody conquest was characterized by systematic implementation of governance principles learned during childhood trauma. Every policy designed to prevent the kind of trust between ruler and subjects that had made his own family vulnerable to mob violence. The underground port that he established served as conduit for arms trafficking that spread violence across the world. Each weapon sold contributing to conflicts that would create more trauma, similar to what had shaped his own development. Sugar's devil fruit abilities provided him with tools for social control that exceeded even his string parasites in their capacity for psychological devastation. The power to transform people into toys, while erasing memories of their existence, creating forms of suffering that had no precedent in human experience. The victims who retained consciousness while being forgotten by everyone they loved experienced isolation more complete than death, their continued existence serving no purpose except to demonstrate the scope of power that he had achieved. The gladiatorial games that he established in the Corridor Colosseum served as entertainment that reflected his understanding of human nature at its most basic level, audiences cheering for violence between desperate men who fought not for glory but for scraps of dignity in a system designed to strip them of everything except raw survival instinct. The popularity of these spectacles among ordinary citizens vindicated his conviction that beneath thin veneer of civilization lay appetites for cruelty that differed from his own only in their hypocrisy. The factory where enslaved toys manufactured weapons operated according to principles of efficiency that reduced formerly human beings to components in production processes, their memories and personalities irrelevant, except insofar as they retained skills necessary for their assigned tasks. The irony that some of these enslaved workers had once been soldiers or craftsmen or parents was lost on no one except the audiences who cheered for the gladiatorial games without recognizing that the toys serving their food had once possessed names and families and dreams. Rebecca's participation in the gladiatorial system from childhood represented the ultimate perversion of his traumatic experiences. A young girl forced to fight for entertainment while being denied even the acknowledgement of her humanity that might have made such exploitation more bearable. Her situation served as perfect mirror of his own childhood suffering, yet he felt no empathy for someone whose pain so closely resembled his own early experiences. The birdcage technique that he deployed during the final crisis of his rule created conditions that transformed an entire population into participants in their own destruction, citizens forced to hunt the very people who were trying to liberate them from tyranny that most of them had learned to accept as natural order. The psychological pressure created by slowly contracting Death Trap revealed how quickly civilized behavior could collapse when survival was threatened, validating his cynical assumptions about human nature under stress. The breakdown of social order that accompanied the birdcage's deployment demonstrated everything that his traumatic childhood had taught him about the fragility of trust and cooperation. Ordinary people turning against neighbors and friends when their own lives were threatened by forces beyond their control. The violence that erupted between former allies vindicated his conviction that all human relationships were ultimately transactional, maintained only so long as mutual benefit could be sustained. Law's personal vendetta against him carried echoes of his own quest for revenge, the young surgeon's trauma-driven mission to destroy the man who had killed his savior, reflecting patterns that Doflamingo recognized from his own psychological development. The irony that his victim had been shaped by similar experiences, yet had reached different conclusions about the proper response to trauma, was lost on someone whose worldview could not accommodate alternatives to the path he had chosen. The revelation of his celestial dragon heritage during the final battle served as reminder that his crimes had been enabled by systems of privilege that continued to protect him even after he had been officially cast out. The world government's reluctance to pursue someone whose knowledge of their secrets made him dangerous, demonstrating the ongoing corruption that his family's original idealism had sought to address. The protection that his status afforded even in exile vindicated every cynical conclusion he had reached about the nature of justice and accountability in a world governed by power rather than principle. The defeat that finally ended his reign represented not redemption or closure, but simply the temporary victory of superior force over inferior, his psychological framework remaining intact, even as his physical capabilities were overwhelmed by opponents who possessed strength that he could not match. The lessons that his childhood trauma had taught him about the primacy of power were confirmed rather than challenged by his downfall, the only surprise being that someone had finally assembled enough force to overcome the advantages that his devil fruit abilities and political connections had provided. The imprisonment that awaited him in Impel Down would provide opportunity for reflection on the path that had led from crucified child to defeated tyrant, yet his fundamental understanding of human nature remained unchanged by experiences that might have taught others the value of mercy and cooperation. The cycle of trauma and revenge that had defined his existence would continue even in captivity, his influence extending through networks of corruption and violence that he had established during his years of power, ensuring that his legacy of systematic cruelty would survive long after his personal capacity for direct harm had been eliminated by stone walls and sea prison bars. The white lead that gleamed like fallen snow across the landscape of Flevance had been celebrated as one of nature's most beautiful gifts, its pristine appearance and valuable properties transforming a modest kingdom in the North Blue into a center of prosperity that drew merchants and admirers from across the world. The mineral's applications seemed limitless, cosmetics that enhanced natural beauty, medicines that promised extended life, industrial materials that could be shaped into products of unprecedented durability and elegance. Yet beneath this surface perfection lay corruption so profound that it would claim an entire civilization, leaving behind only memories preserved in the traumatized mind of a single survivor. The Amber Lead syndrome that slowly consumed Flevance's population operated according to principles that made conventional diseases seem merciful by comparison, its progression measured not in days or weeks, but in generations of accumulated toxicity that passed from parents to children like some grotesque inheritance. The beautiful white substance that had brought such wealth to the kingdom was simultaneously poisoning everyone who came into contact with it, their bodies becoming repositories for contamination that would eventually overwhelm every biological system upon which life depended. Law's family had been among the most prominent in this doomed society, his father serving as a doctor whose medical expertise was regularly consulted by citizens seeking treatment for mysterious ailments that seemed to defy conventional diagnosis. The irony that a physician's household would become ground zero for the most comprehensive medical catastrophe in recorded history was not lost on those who understood the full scope of what was unfolding, though such understanding came too late to save anyone who had already been exposed. The progression of the disease within individual victims followed patterns that suggested deliberate cruelty rather than natural pathology, symptoms manifesting in ways that maximized psychological as well as physical suffering. The white patches that appeared on skin served as external markers of internal corruption that was already irreversible by the time it became visible, each spot representing territory that had been claimed by forces that could not be negotiated with or appeased through medical intervention. The government's response to the crisis revealed depths of callousness that exceeded even the world government's standard operating procedures. Their cover-up operations, more concerned with protecting political relationships than with addressing humanitarian catastrophe that was claiming thousands of innocent lives. The economic benefits that neighboring countries derived from white-led trade created powerful incentives to suppress information about its toxic effects, corporate profits taking precedence over human welfare in calculations that reduced entire populations to acceptable losses. The military cordon that eventually surrounded Flevance was presented to the world as necessary quarantine measure, designed to prevent spread of contagious disease. Though anyone with access to accurate medical information understood that the syndrome was not transmitted through casual contact but through prolonged exposure to contaminated materials. The isolation imposed upon the kingdom served not to protect outsiders, but to ensure that no witnesses survived to testify about the systematic poisoning that had been perpetrated through decades of deliberate concealment. Law's sister Lami represented everything innocent and hopeful about childhood before trauma transformed such qualities into sources of vulnerability rather than strength. Her trust in adult protection and faith in eventual recovery serving as heartbreaking contrast to realities that no child should ever be forced to confront. Her attempts to comfort her younger brother during their family's final days demonstrated courage that exceeded anything displayed by the military forces that were preparing to eliminate everyone she had ever known. The hospital where Law's father continued treating patients, even as his own family succumbed to the same syndrome that was claiming his neighbors, represented dedication to medical ethics that transcended self-preservation, his commitment to healing others remaining absolute, even when such efforts could no longer save those he loved most. The final patients who sought his care were beyond help from conventional medicine, their bodies so thoroughly corrupted by accumulated toxins that only palliative measures could ease their transition toward inevitable death. The evacuation orders that preceded the military assault were designed not to save lives but to create legal pretenses for actions that would otherwise have been recognized as genocide, official proclamations providing bureaucratic cover for extermination campaign that had been planned months in advance. The neighboring countries that participated in this operation had convinced themselves that preemptive mass murder was preferable to risking contamination of their own populations, their fears deliberately exaggerated by authorities who benefited from continued white-lead commerce. The bombing that initiated the systematic extermination of Flevance's population was timed to coincide with evening meal preparations, ensuring maximum civilian casualties as families gathered in their homes for what would prove to be their final shared moments. The incendiary devices that were deployed created fires that burned with unusual intensity due to chemical interactions with white lead deposits that permeated every structure in the kingdom, turning buildings that should have provided shelter into ovens that consumed their occupants alive. Law's escape from the initial bombardment was facilitated by his father's foresight in creating emergency protocols that anticipated exactly the kind of systematic assault that was now being implemented, though no amount of preparation could have adequately addressed the scope of violence that was being deployed against civilians whose only crime had been living in proximity to valuable minerals. The route that carried him away from his burning home led through neighborhoods where he had played as a child, their familiar streets now transformed into corridors of death that challenged his developing mind's ability to process such comprehensive destruction. The bodies that littered these familiar pathways included classmates with whom he had shared lessons just hours earlier, their small forms twisted by violence that had shown no mercy to age or innocence. The teacher who had been explaining mathematics that morning lay sprawled across her own classroom floor, her final lesson written in blood that would never be erased from the memory of the student who discovered her corpse while seeking shelter from the continuing bombardment. The playground where Law had spent countless hours developing the social connections that made childhood bearable had been transformed into an open grave where children's laughter had been replaced by silence so complete that it seemed to absorb sound from the surrounding environment. The swings that still moved in the wind created rhythms that mocked the absence of voices that should have been riding them, their chains creaking with metallic voices that spoke of endings rather than beginnings. The mountain of corpses that would serve as Law's hiding place during the final phase of the extermination represented the culmination of everything that civilized society claimed to oppose. Human beings reduced to anonymous components in a mass grave that served tactical rather than memorial purposes. The soldiers who constructed this grotesque structure treated the bodies with less respect than they would have shown to construction materials, their casual handling of remains revealing how completely they had dehumanized their victims. The smell that permeated this charnel house defied description in conventional language, combining the metallic tang of spilled blood with the sweet corruption of decomposing flesh in proportions that overwhelmed olfactory systems never designed to process such concentrated death. The breathing that Law was forced to control during his hours of hiding became conscious act rather than automatic function, each inhalation carrying particles that connected him physically to the tragedy that surrounded him. The voices of the soldiers who continued their systematic search for survivors carried casual conversations about mundane topics that created surreal contrast with the apocalyptic destruction they were implementing. Their ability to discuss sports and weather while walking among corpses, revealing psychological compartmentalization that bordered on psychopathic. Their laughter at shared jokes echoed across landscapes of ultimate human suffering, creating acoustic environments where comedy and tragedy occupied the same temporal and spatial coordinates. The child who emerged from this hiding place after the military forces completed their withdrawal was no longer recognizable as the boy who had entered it, his psychological transformation as complete as any physical metamorphosis that devil fruit powers might have achieved. The innocence that had characterized his early childhood had been literally buried beneath layers of decomposing humanity, replaced by understanding of mortality and cruelty that most adults spent lifetimes avoiding. The silence that followed the soldier's departure was more oppressive than the sounds of destruction that had preceded it, absence of human activity, creating vacuum that seemed to draw meaning from the surrounding environment. The kingdom that had once bustled with commercial activity and social interaction had been reduced to necropolis, where only memories remained to populate streets that would never again echo with living voices. The discovery of Corazon among Doflamingo's crew represented the first glimpse of hope that Law had encountered since his world had ended in flames and corpses, though his traumatic experiences had taught him to distrust appearances that seemed too good to be true. The Marine officer's cover identity, as mute subordinate, provided perfect camouflage for infiltration mission that required him to gain the confidence of people whose paranoid vigilance made deception extraordinarily dangerous. The relationship that developed between the traumatized child and the undercover agent carried weight that transcended their official roles as pirate crew member and Marine infiltrator, their connection based on mutual recognition of damage that could not be healed through conventional means. Corazon's willingness to risk his carefully constructed identity in order to help Law find treatment for his syndrome demonstrated commitment that went beyond professional duty to encompass something approaching parental love. The medical facilities that they visited during their desperate search for cure revealed the limitations of contemporary medicine when confronted with poisoning on the scale that Law had experienced. Doctors throughout the North Blue lacking both knowledge and resources necessary to address contamination that had progressed to such advanced stages. The rejections that they encountered were motivated not by callousness, but by honest recognition that some conditions exceeded the healing capabilities that medical science had achieved. The O Pope No Me that eventually provided solution to Law's medical crisis carried its own burden of responsibility and potential for corruption. Devil fruit powers that could heal any condition, also possessing capacity to inflict suffering that exceeded natural limitations. The surgery that Corazon underwent to obtain this fruit demonstrated his willingness to sacrifice everything for someone whose survival had become more important to him than his own mission or personal safety. The final confrontation between Corazon and his brother carried emotional weight that transformed what should have been simple execution into tragedy of family bonds, corrupted by irreconcilable differences in moral philosophy, their childhood connection proving insufficient to bridge gaps that trauma had carved between their worldviews. The Marine officer's final words to Law carried instructions and encouragement that would guide the boy's development long after the gunshots that ended his second father's life had faded into memory. The snow that fell during these final moments provided fitting backdrop for ending that combined elements of sacrifice and redemption. White precipitation that served as reminder of the white lead that had initiated this entire chain of tragedy, while simultaneously offering visual representation of purity that could still exist in world contaminated by systematic cruelty. The silence that followed Corazon's death was different from the oppressive quiet that had characterized Flevence's destruction, carrying within it seeds of future purpose, rather than mere absence of meaning. The medical knowledge that Law would eventually acquire during his years of development served not only as means for honoring Corazon's sacrifice, but as weapon that could be deployed against systems of oppression that created conditions where such sacrifices became necessary. His devil fruit abilities, combined with comprehensive understanding of human anatomy, created capabilities that exceeded conventional surgery to encompass forms of healing and harm that operated according to principles that most people could never comprehend, power that carried within it potential for both ultimate mercy and ultimate revenge against those who had destroyed everything he had once considered precious and permanent. The depths of Fishman Island's history contained horrors that made the surface world's casual cruelties seem almost benign by comparison. Centuries of systematic oppression and racial violence, creating wounds so deep that they had infected entire generations with hatred that seemed to transcend rational explanation. The very existence of fishmen as a separate species had been transformed by human prejudice into justification for atrocities that challenged every claim that civilized society made about moral progress their physical differences serving as convenient markers for those who required external validation of their own supposed superiority. The slave markets of Sabaudi Archipelago represented the institutionalization of this racial hatred. Fishmen displayed in cages like exotic animals, while potential buyers evaluated their physical capabilities with the same detached interest that livestock traders brought to cattle auctions. The prices attached to these living beings reflected not just their potential utility as laborers, but the entertainment value that their suffering could provide to owners whose wealth had insulated them from any meaningful understanding of empathy or basic human dignity. The demonstrations of Fishman karate that served as sales presentations revealed the perverse psychology of buyers who found pleasure in witnessing the very strength that they intended to suppress through chains and violence. Their appreciation for martial arts skills, existing alongside complete indifference to the consciousness that had developed such abilities through years of dedicated training. The irony that they celebrated techniques while denying the humanity of those who had mastered them illustrated the cognitive dissonance that allowed such systems to operate without triggering widespread moral revolution. Queen Otohime's assassination had been orchestrated by forces that understood how dangerous hope could become when it began to spread among populations that had been carefully taught to accept their designated place in hierarchies that served oppressor rather than oppressed interests. Her message of coexistence and mutual understanding posed existential threat to economic systems that depended upon maintaining artificial divisions between species. Her growing influence among both fishmen and humans, creating possibilities for cooperation that would undermine centuries of carefully constructed prejudice. The human supremacist who fired the shot that ended her life represented not aberrant individual evil, but logical culmination of ideologies that had been nurtured and reinforced through generations of systematic indoctrination. His willingness to commit murder in service of maintaining racial hierarchy, reflecting values that had been absorbed from cultural environments where such violence was celebrated rather than condemned. The celebration that followed her death among certain segments of human society provided stark illustration of how thoroughly hatred had been normalized in systems that profited from division. Fisher Tiger's crucifixion at the hands of celestial dragons had served purposes that extended far beyond simple punishment for the crime of liberating slaves. The public nature of his torture designed to send messages to anyone who might consider challenging systems of racial oppression that had been established for the convenience of those who benefited from others' unpaid labor. The world nobles who orchestrated his suffering treated his anguish as entertainment, their capacity for empathy so thoroughly atrophied that they could find pleasure in witnessing pain that would have traumatized normal observers. The branding that marked Fisher Tiger's body served dual purposes of identification and psychological warfare. The heated metal that burned celestial dragon symbols into his flesh, creating permanent reminders of powerlessness that were intended to break his spirit long before they damaged his body. The scars that resulted from this torture would influence every decision he made for the remainder of his life, their presence serving as constant reinforcement of lessons about power dynamics that no amount of subsequent success could completely erase. The sun pirates that emerged from Tiger's liberation of Marieshwa's slaves represented both triumph of cooperative resistance and demonstration of how trauma could create bonds between individuals who might otherwise have remained strangers. Their shared experiences of systematic abuse providing foundation for loyalty that transcended the tribal divisions that had previously characterized Fishman society. The sun symbol that they adopted served as deliberate rejection of the marks that had been burned into their flesh by oppressors, their chosen identity overwriting imposed symbols with meanings that they had selected for themselves. The internal conflicts that eventually destroyed this alliance revealed how deeply the poison of racial hatred could penetrate even communities that had been formed specifically to resist such divisions. Human crew members who had fought alongside fishmen for their mutual liberation, still carrying prejudices that emerged during moments of stress or disagreement. The betrayal that led to Tiger's death demonstrated that solidarity forged in crisis could prove fragile when tested by the kinds of moral complexity that characterized life beyond simple survival situations. Arlong's transformation from liberation fighter into oppressor represented the most tragic outcome of the cycle of violence that racial hatred inevitably created. His justified anger at human cruelty gradually expanding until it encompassed hatred of entire species, rather than specific individuals who had committed crimes against his people. The concentration camp mentality that had been imposed upon fishmen through centuries of systematic abuse became template for his own approach to governance, his Arlong Park serving as inverted mirror of human supremacist systems rather than genuine alternative to oppression. The village of Kokoyasi, that fell under Arlong's control, provided perfect laboratory for testing whether victims of systematic oppression could avoid becoming oppressors themselves when given sufficient power over their former tormentors. The results demonstrating that trauma, without healing, inevitably reproduced the patterns that had created it in the first place. The humans who found themselves subject to fishman rule experienced the same kinds of arbitrary violence and economic exploitation that their species had historically inflicted upon others, though their suffering provided no satisfaction for observers who understood that justice could not be achieved through mere reversal of existing hierarchies. Belmer's execution in front of her adopted daughters represented culmination of everything that was wrong with cycles of revenge that transformed victims into perpetrators, without addressing underlying systems that made such transformation possible, her death serving no strategic purpose, except to demonstrate that Arlong possessed power to inflict the same kinds of family-destroying trauma that fishmen had experienced at human hands for generations. The psychological impact on Nami and Nojiko of witnessing their mother's murder would influence their development in ways that extended far beyond immediate grief, creating wounds that could only be healed through forms of justice that transcended simple punishment. Nami's forced servitude as Arlong's navigator created conditions that paralleled historical fishman slavery in ways that were clearly intentional, her skills valued, while her humanity was systematically denied through treatment that reduced her worth to purely utilitarian calculations. The maps that she was compelled to create served purposes that went beyond simple navigation, each chart representing another piece of freedom that was being taken from communities that had never harmed anyone, but had the misfortune to exist in territories that Arlong coveted for expansion. The psychological warfare that accompanied this enslavement involved manipulation of hope that was even more cruel than simple despair would have been. Arlong's promise to free Kokoyasi in exchange for impossible ransom, creating motivation that kept his victim working while ensuring that liberation remained perpetually out of reach. The corruption of Marine officers who helped maintain this system demonstrated how thoroughly institutional racism had penetrated even organizations that were theoretically dedicated to protecting all citizens regardless of species. The 100 million berries that Nami struggled to accumulate through years of theft and cartography represented more than simple ransom payment. Each coin earned through activities that required her to suppress natural impulses toward honesty and trust in favor of survival strategies that damaged her own moral development while serving her oppressor's interests. The isolation that such work required prevented her from forming relationships that might have provided emotional support, leaving her trapped in patterns of behavior that reinforced the very system she was trying to escape. The revelation that Arlong had been collaborating with corrupt Marines to ensure that her ransom could never be paid represented betrayal that went beyond simple breach of contract to encompass systematic psychological torture that had been designed from the beginning to create maximum despair at the moment when victory seemed closest. The destruction of her life's work through officially sanctioned theft demonstrated how completely the institutions that claimed to represent justice had been corrupted by racial prejudice and economic incentives that made oppression profitable. Hody Jones's rise to power represented evolution of racial hatred, from reactive trauma response to proactive ideological system that could sustain itself through indoctrination, rather than requiring continued exposure to actual oppression. His supremacist philosophy, drawing strength from historical grievances, while extending them into territories that had no basis in personal experience. The energy steroids that fueled his transformation served as perfect metaphor for how artificial enhancement of natural anger could create capabilities that exceeded normal limitations, while simultaneously destroying the user's long-term viability. The mob psychology that characterized his movement revealed how easily populations that had experienced genuine oppression could be manipulated into supporting programs that promised empowerment through violence against former tormentors, their legitimate grievances, providing foundation for ideologies that ultimately served no constructive purpose except satisfying psychological needs for revenge that could never be fully satisfied through external action. The children who were recruited into this movement demonstrated how hatred could be transmitted across generations even when direct experience of oppression was absent. The coup attempt that brought Hody's faction to power relied upon manipulation of historical trauma in ways that made rational evaluation of current circumstances impossible, past injustices serving as justification for present violence that exceeded anything that had originally triggered the cycle of retribution. The hostage situation that developed around the Neptune family created conditions where innocent individuals became symbols in ideological conflicts that had grown far beyond their original scope or purpose. The Levely incident that had originally triggered human fear of fishmen represented exactly the kind of misunderstanding that racial prejudice made inevitable. Assumptions about evil intent, coloring interpretation of events in ways that transformed accidents into evidence of inherent moral deficiency. The escalation that followed demonstrated how quickly fear could transform into hatred when populations had been conditioned to view other species as existential threats rather than potential partners in building more equitable societies. Princess Shirahoshi's power to command Sea Kings represented both ultimate weapon that could be deployed in service of fishman supremacy and ultimate responsibility that required transcending racial divisions in favor of protecting all life regardless of species affiliation. Her choice to use such devastating capabilities for healing rather than revenge provided example of how trauma could be transformed into wisdom rather than simply passed along to future generations as inherited obligation to continue cycles of violence. The integration attempts that followed various conflicts revealed the ongoing challenges that arose when trying to build trust between communities whose historical relationship had been defined by systematic abuse and mutual fear. Progress requiring not just political agreements, but psychological healing that addressed trauma that had accumulated over centuries of reciprocal violence. The children who grew up during these transition periods carried within them possibilities for genuine change that their parents' generation could barely imagine, though their development remained vulnerable to influences that could channel their energy toward either cooperation or continued conflict. The underground networks that connected Fishman Island to surface world criminal organizations demonstrated how racial oppression created conditions that made illegal activities seem like rational responses to systems that offered no legitimate paths to prosperity or security. Desperate communities turning to smuggling and piracy as alternatives to poverty that had been artificially imposed through discriminatory policies. The weapons trafficking that flourished in these environments provided tools for violence that made conflicts more deadly while doing nothing to address underlying inequities that had created demand for such trade. The religious significance that some fishmen attached to ancient prophecies about chosen leaders who would lead their people to promised lands revealed how spiritual traditions could be corrupted by political movements that used sacred narratives to justify contemporary violence, divine mandate becoming excuse for actions that contradicted the compassionate values that had originally inspired such beliefs. The manipulation of faith for political purposes created schisms within communities that had historically found unity through shared religious practice. The environmental destruction that accompanied various conflicts served as a reminder that racial hatred ultimately damaged everyone involved, poisoned rivers, and destroyed habitats affecting all species that depended upon healthy ecosystems, regardless of their political affiliations or historical grievances. The restoration efforts that followed demonstrated possibilities for cooperation that transcended traditional divisions, shared work on practical problems, creating relationships that could serve as foundation for broader social healing that addressed root causes of conflict rather than simply managing their symptoms through temporary truces that left underlying issues unresolved. The underwater fortress of Impel Down rose from the ocean floor like a monument to humanity's capacity for systematic cruelty. Its 6 levels, descending through progressively more sophisticated forms of torture that had been refined over centuries of experimentation on prisoners whose crimes ranged from minor infractions to genuine threats to world stability. The genius of its design lay not merely in the physical suffering it inflicted, but in the psychological architecture that transformed punishment into entertainment for guards who had learned to find pleasure in the systematic destruction of human dignity. Level 1's Crimson Hell presented newcomers to the prison system with their first taste of what awaited them in the depths below. The bladegrass forest that covered its landscape, serving dual purposes of natural camouflage and perpetual torture device. The red-leafed plants that carpeted every surface had been cultivated specifically for their ability to inflict thousands of tiny cuts that individually meant nothing but collectively created constant agony that prevented sleep, rest, or any moment of peace that might allow prisoners to maintain psychological stability. The puzzle scorpions that hunted through this crimson maze possessed venom that was carefully calibrated to cause maximum pain without providing the mercy of death, their stings creating burning sensations that lasted for days while leaving victims fully conscious and aware of their continuing degradation. The creatures had been bred specifically for their role as living torture devices, their natural hunting instincts enhanced through selective breeding that emphasized cruelty over efficiency, their attacks timed to prevent any adaptation that might reduce their effectiveness. The screams that echoed through Level 1's corridors served not just as expressions of individual suffering, but as psychological warfare against new arrivals, who could hear exactly what awaited them if they violated any of the public's countless regulations that governed prisoner behavior. The acoustics of the level had been designed to amplify these sounds while preventing any communication between prisoners that might lead to cooperation or mutual support. Isolation becoming weapon that was deployed alongside physical torture. Level 2's Beast Hell represented escalation in both creativity and cruelty. Its menagerie of carnivorous creatures, providing variety in forms of suffering that prevented prisoners from developing coping mechanisms that might reduce the effectiveness of their punishment. The basilisk, that served as the level's primary predator, possessed abilities that went beyond simple physical threat to encompass psychological warfare that operated through manipulation of primal fears that no amount of mental preparation could overcome. The Sphinx, that guarded certain corridors, combined human intelligence with predatory instincts in ways that made it capable of designing individualized forms of psychological torture tailored to each prisoner's specific vulnerabilities, its riddles serving not as intellectual challenges, but as methods for identifying mental weaknesses that could be exploited through other means. The creature's ability to speak allowed it to engage in conversations that seemed friendly while gathering information that would later be used to maximize each victim's suffering. The manticores that roamed freely through the level possessed human faces that made their attacks particularly disturbing. Their ability to express complex emotions while simultaneously devouring human flesh, creating cognitive dissonance that challenged prisoners' ability to maintain clear distinctions between civilization and savagery. The pleasure that these creatures took in their work was evident in their expressions, their human-like features conveying enjoyment that made their attacks feel personal rather than merely predatory. Level 3's Starvation Hell employed methods that were elegant in their simplicity, the desert environment creating conditions where basic survival required constant effort while providing no opportunities for the kind of meaningful activity that might preserve psychological health. The heat that radiated from sand and stone was maintained at levels that forced continuous dehydration, while ensuring that the small amounts of water provided to prisoners could never fully restore what was lost through perspiration and respiration. The mirages that plagued this level were artificially enhanced through devil fruit powers that made psychological torture indistinguishable from environmental conditions. Prisoners' desperate thirst creating hallucinations that were then amplified and manipulated to maximize their disorienting effects. The oases that appeared in the distance promised relief that would vanish upon approach, hope becoming weapon that was deployed with surgical precision to create maximum despair. The Bonaro dragons that occasionally appeared on this level served as reminders that even in this hellish environment, worse fates remained possible for those who violated prison regulations, their attacks providing brief respite from heat and thirst through trauma so severe that all other suffering temporarily became irrelevant. The unpredictability of these encounters meant that prisoners could never relax their vigilance, exhaustion becoming compounded by constant fear of predation. Level 4's Blazing Hell represented perhaps the most straightforward approach to systematic torture. Its pools of boiling blood and cauldrons of fire, creating environments where physical agony reached levels that challenged the human nervous system's capacity to process pain. The chief guard Sadi, who oversaw operations on this level, had developed techniques that maximized suffering while preventing the unconsciousness that might provide temporary escape from torment. The whips and chains that adorned this level's torture chambers were crafted from materials that conducted heat in ways that made even brief contact excruciating, their use requiring skills that had been refined through years of practice on prisoners who provided involuntary feedback about which techniques produced optimal results. The guards who worked on this level underwent psychological evaluation to ensure that they possessed the mental characteristics necessary for inflicting systematic torture without experiencing empathy that might interfere with their duties. The puzzle scorpions that appeared on this level were larger and more aggressive than their counterparts above, their increased size allowing them to inflict correspondingly greater amounts of venom, while their enhanced intelligence made them capable of coordinating attacks that prevented prisoners from finding any safe spaces within their cells. The breeding programs that produced these creatures represented collaboration between prison officials and underground scientists whose research pushed the boundaries of what biological enhancement could achieve. Level 5's freezing hell created conditions that were opposite to those found above while achieving similar results in terms of prisoner suffering. The extreme cold that permeated every surface, making survival dependent upon constant movement, that exhausted already weakened bodies, while providing no opportunity for rest or recovery. The wolves that hunted through this frozen wasteland were enhanced through surgical procedures that increased their size and aggression while reducing their natural fear of humans to nothing. The psychological impact of transitioning from blazing heat to freezing cold created additional layers of trauma that went beyond what either environment could achieve individually, the contrast serving as reminder of the artificial nature of their suffering, while demonstrating the sophisticated understanding of human physiology that had gone into designing these torture methods. The clothes provided to prisoners were deliberately inadequate for the conditions, their thin fabric serving symbolic rather than practical purposes. The food that was distributed on this level was often frozen, solid, forcing prisoners to choose between starvation and the additional suffering that came from attempting to consume ice that would further lower their body temperature while providing minimal nutritional value. The water that was available was similarly frozen, its consumption requiring prisoners to use body heat that they could not afford to lose, while failing to provide adequate hydration for their continuing survival needs. Level 6's infinite hell represented the ultimate destination for prisoners whose crimes had exceeded even the prison system's capacity for measured response. Its cells designed to provide perfect isolation that eliminated every form of stimulation except the prisoner's own thoughts and memories. The silence that pervaded this level was so complete that it became oppressive force in its own right. The absence of sound creating acoustic environment that made even heartbeats seem unnaturally loud. The prisoners who occupied these cells included individuals whose power and influence had once shaped world events, their current helplessness serving as demonstration of the state's capacity to reduce even the most formidable opponents to broken shadows of their former selves. The conversations that occasionally occurred between these condemned souls revealed the psychological strategies they had developed for maintaining sanity in conditions designed to eliminate every foundation upon which mental health depended. The food delivery system that served this level was designed to minimize human contact while maximizing the psychological impact of isolation, prisoners receiving sustenance through slots that opened and closed without revealing any trace of the individuals who provided it. The timing of these deliveries was deliberately randomized to prevent prisoners from developing any sense of routine that might provide psychological anchoring in an environment otherwise devoid of structure. Magellan's presence as chief warden represented the perfect fusion of devil fruit power with institutional authority, his poison abilities creating capabilities for torture that exceeded what conventional methods could achieve, while his administrative responsibilities ensured that such capabilities would be deployed with maximum efficiency. The venom demon form that he could assume represented ultimate expression of systematic cruelty, made manifest in physical form. His ability to fill entire sections of the prison with toxic gases that caused excruciating pain without providing the release of death. The antidotes that existed for his various poisons were carefully controlled to ensure that they could be deployed selectively to prolong suffering rather than eliminate it. Medical knowledge being perverted into instrument of torture that violated every principle upon which healing arts were supposed to be based. The doctors who worked within the prison system had undergone psychological conditioning that allowed them to participate in systematic torture while maintaining professional competence in their medical duties. The rebellion that erupted during Luffy's infiltration revealed the psychological pressure that had been building within the prison system for decades. Prisoners whose individual resistance had been broken by systematic torture, finding collective strength when provided with leadership that offered hope of escape. The violence that accompanied this uprising demonstrated how completely the prison environment had brutalized everyone within it. Guards and prisoners alike transformed into combatants whose capacity for mercy had been eliminated through years of exposure to systematic cruelty. The breakout that followed involved coordination between individuals whose only common ground was their shared hatred of the system that had imprisoned them. Ideological enemies finding temporary alliance in their mutual desire for freedom from conditions that had reduced them to desperate animals, willing to cooperate with anyone who offered prospects for escape. The chaos that spread through multiple levels simultaneously overwhelmed security systems that had been designed to handle individual escape attempts rather than coordinated mass rebellion. Bon Clay's sacrifice during the final phases of this escape demonstrated how extreme circumstances could reveal nobility that had survived despite prolonged exposure to conditions designed to eliminate every trace of human decency. His willingness to accept certain recapture in order to ensure his friend's freedom, providing counterpoint to the systematic dehumanization that characterized everything else about the prison system. The tears that accompanied his farewell served as a reminder that emotional capacity could endure even in environments specifically constructed to eliminate such responses. The newcomer paradise that had been secretly established within the prison's hidden spaces represented remarkable achievement in creating community and mutual support within institution, designed to prevent exactly such cooperation. Ivankov's leadership having fostered development of alternative society that operated according to principles diametrically opposed to those that governed official prison policy. The hormone treatments that were available within this sanctuary provided both physical transformation and psychological healing that helped prisoners maintain identity despite systematic attempts to eliminate individuality. The long-term psychological effects on those who survived imprisonment in Impel Down would continue to influence their behavior and relationships for years after their physical escape. Trauma that had been inflicted through systematic torture, creating wounds that could not be healed simply through return to normal social environments. The nightmares that plagued former prisoners served as continuing reminder of how deeply institutional cruelty could penetrate human consciousness, their recovery requiring therapeutic interventions that went far beyond what most medical systems were equipped to provide. The broader implications of Impel Down's existence extended beyond its immediate function as detention facility to encompass questions about the nature of justice and the proper limits of state power. Its systematic torture programs representing logical extension of philosophies that justified unlimited government authority in pursuit of social control. The international recognition that such institution received from world governments demonstrated how thoroughly concepts of human rights had been subordinated to practical considerations of maintaining order through fear and intimidation, that operated on scales designed to discourage any challenge to existing power structures. The isolated nation of Wano country had endured 25 years of systematic oppression that transformed what had once been a land of honor and prosperity into a grotesque theater where suffering served as entertainment for tyrants, whose capacity for cruelty seemed to expand with each passing season. The closed borders that had historically protected this ancient kingdom from external interference became prison walls that trapped its citizens within a nightmare of their own rulers' making, their traditional values of loyalty and endurance perverted into tools that facilitated their own destruction. Kurozumi Orochi's rise to power represented the culmination of generational hatred that had fermented in darkness for decades, his family's persecution creating wounds that had never healed. but instead transformed into malignant obsessions with revenge that would ultimately consume innocent populations who bore no responsibility for historical injustices. The child who had been punished for his grandfather's crimes had grown into a monster whose definition of justice required the systematic torture of everyone who belonged to the society that had rejected his bloodline. The Yamata no Orochi devil fruit that granted him his serpentine transformation served as perfect metaphor for the psychological poison that had consumed his humanity, each of his 8 heads representing different aspects of paranoia and cruelty that had replaced whatever capacity for empathy might have existed in his original personality. The regenerative abilities that allowed him to survive decapitation became symbols of how thoroughly evil could entrench itself when given sufficient time to establish institutional foundations. The public executions that became regular entertainment under his regime were designed not merely to eliminate political opponents, but to create psychological conditioning that would transform Wano's proud warrior culture into a cowering population of traumatized survivors who had learned that resistance led inevitably to deaths that served no purpose except satisfying their rulers' sadistic appetites. The crucifixions that became his preferred method of execution were chosen specifically for their ability to maximize both physical suffering and symbolic humiliation. The poisoning of Wano's rivers represented environmental warfare that demonstrated Orochi's willingness to sacrifice the long-term viability of his own kingdom in service of immediate gratification and control over populations whose survival depended upon resources that he could contaminate or withhold at will. The factories that produced weapons for Kaido's war machine discharged toxins that would render agricultural land barren for generations, ensuring that future rebellions would be weakened by malnutrition and disease even before they could organize effective resistance. The children who were forced to work in these industrial facilities from ages as young as 5 or 6 experienced childhoods that consisted entirely of labor so dangerous that survival to adulthood represented achievement rather than expectation, their developing bodies damaged by chemical exposure and physical stress that would create lifelong disabilities even among those fortunate enough to escape the factory system. The education that they received consisted entirely of propaganda designed to convince them that their suffering was necessary sacrifice for the greater good of maintaining social stability. Kaido's presence on the island transformed Orochi's petty tyranny into something approaching apocalyptic nightmare, the Emperor's suicidal depression manifesting in governance strategies that treated entire populations as expendable resources in experiments designed to determine the most efficient methods for inflicting despair. The beast pirates, who served under his command, had been selected specifically for their capacity to commit atrocities without experiencing psychological stress that might interfere with their duties. The hobby of suicide attempts that defined Kaido's personal entertainment revealed depths of existential horror that exceeded even his political crimes. His indestructible body trapping him within existence that had become unbearable, while simultaneously preventing him from achieving the death that represented his only remaining desire. The methods he employed in these attempts grew progressively more elaborate and destructive, his jumps from sky islands creating impact craters that served as monuments to despair made manifest in geological formations. The alcohol that he consumed in quantities that would kill normal humans served dual purposes of numbing psychological pain, while simultaneously fueling rages that made him even more dangerous to everyone within his vicinity. His drinking binges creating periods of unpredictable violence that could transform routine interactions into life-threatening encounters. The servants who attended him during these episodes had learned to read subtle changes in his expression that might provide warning of impending explosions that could level entire sections of whatever structure happened to contain him. The Smile Factory that produced artificial devil fruits represented perhaps the most comprehensively evil project ever conceived, its operations requiring systematic exploitation of child labor while producing results that condemned 90% of consumers to lives of perpetual artificial happiness that masked underlying psychological torture. The children who were kidnapped from their families to work in this facility experienced forms of abuse that combined physical labor with chemical exposure that would affect their development in ways that medical science barely understood. Tama's poisoning from contaminated river water served as representative example of how Orochi's environmental crimes affected even the most innocent members of Wano's population, her illness demonstrating the long-term consequences of policies that prioritized immediate control over sustainable governance that might preserve options for future generations. Her ability to create food from devil fruit powers became cruel irony in land where malnutrition was artificially imposed despite abundant natural resources. The Ebisu Town District represented the ultimate expression of Smile Factory's horrific effects on civilian populations, its residents condemned to perpetual laughter that prevented them from expressing genuine emotions, even during moments of profound grief or terror. The psychological torture involved in being unable to mourn lost loved ones or express fear during life-threatening situations created forms of mental anguish that had no precedent in human experience, their permanent smiles serving as masks that concealed suffering that could never be adequately communicated. Yasui's execution, in front of these artificially cheerful citizens, created scenes of surreal horror where genuine tragedy was accompanied by involuntary laughter that mocked the solemnity that such moments required. The crowd's inability to express appropriate grief, transforming state-sanctioned murder into grotesque comedy that served Orochi's purposes while traumatizing everyone forced to participate as audience. The psychological damage inflicted upon witnesses who wanted to mourn but could only laugh would persist long after the immediate trauma had ended. Killer's transformation into perpetually laughing assassin represented personal tragedy that illustrated how smile fruits could destroy individual identity while leaving physical capabilities intact. His original personality buried beneath artificial emotional responses that made him unable to express the genuine feelings that continued to exist within his compromised consciousness. The fights that he engaged in while laughing uncontrollably created cognitive dissonance that challenged observers' ability to distinguish between voluntary and involuntary actions. The manufacturing processes that created these artificial fruits involved extraction of essence from individuals whose natural emotions were processed into commodities that could be sold to purchasers who remained unaware of the human cost that had gone into producing their artificial enhancement. The workers who operated this equipment had been psychologically conditioned to ignore the moral implications of their activities, their training emphasizing technical efficiency while systematically suppressing empathy that might interfere with productivity. Kozuki Oden's torture during his final hour represented culmination of everything that was wrong with Orochi's approach to governance. His execution designed not simply to eliminate political opposition, but to provide public demonstration of what happened to those who challenged established authority, even when such challenges were motivated by genuine concern for civilian welfare. The boiling oil that served as his execution method was chosen specifically for its ability to maximize both physical suffering and symbolic humiliation. The dance that Oden performed naked through the streets of the flower capital before his execution served dual purposes of satisfying Orochi's sadistic entertainment preferences while systematically destroying the dignity and reputation that had made him an effective leader capable of inspiring others to resist tyrannical governance. The citizens who were forced to witness this humiliation experienced trauma that extended beyond immediate shock to encompass long-term psychological damage that made future resistance seem futile and dangerous. The promise that motivated Odin's endurance during the boiling execution was designed by Orochi to create hope that would make his suffering more acute, while simultaneously ensuring that such hope would ultimately prove false. The temporary reprieve offered to his retainers serving not as genuine mercy, but as psychological torture that made their eventual deaths more traumatic. The hour that he spent holding them above the oil while his own flesh cooked demonstrated strength that transcended normal human limitations while serving as testament to love that could persist even under conditions designed to eliminate every trace of human connection. Toki's time travel abilities that had brought the scabbards forward 20 years represented both salvation and additional layer of psychological torture, her followers awakening to find that everyone they had known was dead, while the tyranny they had sought to prevent had only grown stronger during their absence. The isolation that they experienced upon discovering how completely their world had changed was compounded by survivor guilt that made their mission feel like additional burden rather than opportunity for redemption. The factory workers who had been transformed into artificial devil fruit users against their will experienced identity crises that went beyond simple physical changes to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness and free will, their enhanced abilities serving as constant reminders of violations that had been perpetrated upon their bodies without their consent. The psychological support systems that might have helped them adjust to these changes had been systematically eliminated by governance policies that treated mental health as luxury rather than necessity. The geishas who served in Orochi's pleasure quarters experienced forms of exploitation that combined sexual violence with political espionage, their training emphasizing submission and entertainment skills, while preparing them to gather intelligence that could be used against clients who trusted them with sensitive information. The psychological conditioning required to maintain performance standards while enduring systematic abuse created dissociative disorders that allowed them to function professionally while protecting core identity from complete destruction. The samurai class that had historically provided Wano's moral and military leadership found themselves systematically eliminated through policies that targeted not just individual warriors, but the cultural traditions that had produced them. Their code of honor transformed from social foundation into liability that made them easy targets for persecution. The survivors who managed to avoid execution were often forced to abandon their principles in order to protect family members who were held hostage by authorities that understood how to exploit traditional values for purposes of social control. The religious sites that had once served as centers of spiritual community were systematically desecrated through activities designed to demonstrate that no institution remained beyond the reach of state power. Sacred spaces converted into venues for activities that deliberately mocked the beliefs and practices that had historically provided comfort and guidance during difficult periods. The priests and monks who had maintained these facilities were subjected to particular cruelty as representatives of value systems that competed with absolute state authority. The cultural festivals that had historically celebrated seasonal changes and community achievements were transformed into propaganda events that used traditional forms and rituals to promote messages that contradicted the values these celebrations had originally embodied. Artistic expression becoming a tool of psychological warfare, rather than genuine communication of shared identity and purpose. The artists who participated in these corrupted festivals experienced moral conflicts between professional obligations and personal integrity that created psychological stress with no clear resolution. The resistance networks that attempted to maintain underground opposition to Orochi's regime found themselves infiltrated by informants whose cooperation had been secured through threats against family members, their efforts systematically compromised by surveillance systems that turned natural human connections into weapons that could be deployed against those who dared to organize collective action. The paranoia that resulted from these betrayals made trust impossible, even among those who shared common goals and genuine commitment to liberation. The final battle that would eventually free Wano from this comprehensive nightmare was motivated not just by strategic considerations but by moral imperative to end forms of suffering that had exceeded every reasonable limit of human endurance. The warriors who participated in this conflict, understanding that victory represented not just political change, but restoration of basic dignity to population that had been systematically dehumanized through decades of carefully calculated abuse. The scars that would remain after liberation would require generations to heal, but the possibility of such healing represented hope that had sustained resistance through 25 years of darkness that had threatened to extinguish every trace of what Wano had once been and might someday become again. The Marine headquarters at Marineford stood as monument to institutional power that claimed moral authority while systematically perpetrating atrocities that exceeded in scope and cruelty anything committed by the pirates they claimed to oppose. Their doctrine of absolute justice serving as philosophical framework that transformed systematic murder into righteous duty and genocide into necessary sacrifice for the greater good of maintaining world order. The officers who rose through the ranks of this organization were selected not for their commitment to protecting innocent civilians, but for their willingness to follow orders that violated every principle upon which genuine justice was supposed to be founded. Admiral Sakazuki embodied everything that was corrupt about this system, his magma-based devil fruit abilities serving as perfect metaphor for the burning hatred that had consumed whatever capacity for empathy might have existed in his original personality before years of indoctrination had transformed him into a living weapon that served institutional interests rather than human welfare. The volcanic fury that characterized his attacks was matched only by the cold calculation that guided his strategic thinking, his willingness to sacrifice subordinates and civilians alike in pursuit of objectives that served abstract principles rather than actual people. The incident at Ohara that had established his reputation among Marine leadership revealed the depths of moral bankruptcy that absolute justice could achieve when applied by someone whose psychological profile made him incapable of distinguishing between legitimate military targets and innocent civilians whose only crime had been existing in proximity to individuals deemed threatening by government authorities. The refugee ship that he destroyed had been filled with scholars and their families, people whose dedication to knowledge and learning posed no conceivable threat to anyone except those who profited from ignorance and historical amnesia. The justification that he provided for this mass murder demonstrated how thoroughly institutional propaganda had corrupted his understanding of moral reasoning, his conviction that eliminating potential future threats justified present atrocities, revealing thought processes that had abandoned human sympathy in favor of utilitarian calculations that reduced individual lives to statistical abstractions. The children who died in that attack had been guilty of nothing except being born to parents whose intellectual curiosity had inconvenienced those who maintained power through control of information. The subordinate Marine who attempted to protest this massacre found himself on the receiving end of the same magma fist that had been deployed against civilian targets, his death serving as demonstration to other officers that questioning superior orders carried consequences that made obedience the only rational choice for those who valued their own survival. The message that this execution sent throughout the Marine ranks was clear and comprehensive. Moral qualms were luxury that could not be afforded by those who served institutional objectives that transcended individual conscience. The promotion that followed Sakazuki's actions at Ohara demonstrated how completely the Marine command structure had been corrupted by philosophies that rewarded extreme violence while punishing compassionate restraint, his advancement serving as encouragement to other officers who might be considering similar approaches to dealing with civilian populations that harbored individuals deemed problematic by government authorities. The medal ceremonies that celebrated such achievements transformed mass murder into heroic service worthy of public recognition and institutional gratitude. Rob Lucci's recruitment into CP9 represented even more systematic approach to creating government agents, whose capacity for violence was matched only by their complete indifference to human suffering. His training beginning in childhood with assignments that were designed to eliminate whatever traces of empathy might have existed in his developing personality. The first murder that he committed at age 13 was not an aberrant act of juvenile violence, but carefully planned exercise designed to test his suitability for roles that required complete subordination of personal moral judgment to institutional directives. The Water 7 infiltration that occupied 5 years of his life demonstrated the sophisticated deception capabilities that government intelligence services had developed. His ability to maintain cover identity while building genuine relationships with targets who trusted him, completely revealing how thoroughly emotional manipulation could be weaponized by those who possessed sufficient training and psychological conditioning. The friendships that he formed during this period were not complications that interfered with his mission, but tools that enhanced his effectiveness by providing intimate knowledge of his target's vulnerabilities. The psychological torture that he inflicted upon Robin during the Tower of Justice incident was designed not merely to extract information, but to demonstrate the futility of resistance against government power. His casual discussion of assassination techniques serving as reminder that her survival depended entirely upon continued cooperation with authorities whose mercy could be withdrawn at any moment without explanation or appeal. The clinical precision with which he described various methods of execution revealed professional pride in capabilities that most humans would find deeply disturbing. Spandam's role as CP9 commander illustrated how institutional authority could shield incompetent sadists from consequences of their actions, while providing them with access to victims whose suffering served no purpose except satisfying psychological needs that had been shaped by years of unchecked power over helpless subjects. His inability to match his subordinates' physical capabilities was more than compensated by political connections that made him effectively untouchable regardless of how spectacularly his operational decisions might fail. The elephant sword that served as Spandam's primary weapon represented his understanding that technological enhancement could substitute for personal skill when backed by sufficient institutional authority. The blade's ability to transform into different shapes, allowing him to inflict various forms of physical damage while maintaining safe distance from opponents who might otherwise overpower him through superior combat abilities. The psychological satisfaction that he derived from using this weapon revealed sadistic tendencies that had been nurtured rather than corrected through his career advancement. The Buster Call authorization that he possessed represented ultimate expression of Marine willingness to sacrifice entire populations in service of eliminating individual threats. The nuclear option that could reduce thriving cities to smoking craters while providing legal cover for perpetrators who could claim they had been following legitimate orders issued through proper chains of command. The casual manner in which such devastating capabilities could be deployed revealed how thoroughly institutional thinking had divorced itself from consideration of human consequences. The systematic recruitment of child soldiers into Marine ranks violated every international convention regarding protection of minors, while providing steady supply of psychologically malleable recruits who could be shaped according to institutional requirements without interference from moral frameworks that might have been established through normal family and community relationships. The training programs that these children endured were designed to break down natural empathy while building up capacity for violence that served organizational rather than personal objectives. The indoctrination processes that accompanied this training involved systematic exposure to propaganda that portrayed government enemies as subhuman threats whose elimination was necessary for protection of civilized society. Complex political situations reduced to simple narratives that justified extreme violence while preventing critical analysis that might lead recruits to question orders that violated basic moral principles. The repetition and reinforcement techniques that were employed created psychological conditioning that made obedience automatic rather than conscious choice. The psychological evaluation procedures that determined advancement within Marine ranks were designed to identify individuals whose personality profiles made them suitable for roles that required systematic violation of human rights. Empathetic candidates being systematically weeded out, while those who demonstrated appropriate levels of callousness were fast-tracked toward positions of greater authority and responsibility. The testing methods that were employed created selection pressure that ensured institutional culture would remain consistent across generations of leadership. The cover-up operations that followed various Marine atrocities demonstrated sophisticated understanding of information warfare that allowed even massive crimes to be concealed from public awareness through careful manipulation of media narratives and strategic elimination of witnesses whose testimony might compromise official versions of events. The journalists who attempted to investigate these incidents found themselves facing professional destruction or physical elimination that sent clear messages to others who might consider similar pursuits. The veteran officers who expressed doubts about institutional direction found themselves assigned to remote postings where their influence could be minimized, while their experience was gradually marginalized through bureaucratic procedures that made their expertise irrelevant to operational, decision-making processes. The pension systems that governed their retirement were structured to ensure continued loyalty, even from those who had developed moral qualms about activities they had been required to perform during their active service. Marineford's transformation into battlefield during the war that would determine ACE's fate demonstrated how completely military installations could be militarized for purposes that served political theater rather than genuine security needs. The execution platform that had been constructed serving as stage for demonstration of government power that was intended to intimidate potential opponents while providing entertainment for audiences who had been conditioned to find pleasure in systematic violence against designated enemies. The propaganda value that was extracted from broadcasting this execution globally revealed sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare that operated through manipulation of public emotion rather than rational persuasion. The spectacle designed to create feelings of helplessness among those who might otherwise consider challenging government authority, while reinforcing loyalty among supporters who found satisfaction in witnessing defeat of enemies they had been taught to hate. The manipulation of family bonds as weapons against enemy forces demonstrated how thoroughly institutional thinking had corrupted natural human connections. Garp's forced choice between duty and personal loyalty, serving as perfect example of how systematic indoctrination could transform loving relationships into sources of psychological torture that enhanced rather than limited government power over individual behavior. The tears that fell during these moments of forced betrayal provided satisfaction to superiors who understood that broken hearts created more reliable subordinates than intact consciences. The revelation of Ace's parentage as weapon deployed against enemy morale represented pinnacle of psychological warfare that used private family information as ammunition in conflicts where victory required not just physical defeat, but complete spiritual destruction of opposing forces. The transformation of personal identity into political liability, demonstrating how thoroughly individual humanity had been subordinated to institutional objectives that recognized no limits on acceptable methods for achieving desired outcomes. The casualty reports that followed this conflict were carefully edited to minimize apparent costs while maximizing perception of decisive victory. Statistical manipulation, ensuring that public understanding of events would support rather than challenge government narratives about necessity and effectiveness of extreme violence as solution to political problems that might otherwise have been addressed through diplomatic means that preserved rather than destroyed human life and dignity. The medical facilities that treated wounded Marines following these operations were staffed by personnel who had been specifically trained to provide care while maintaining operational security that prevented patients from discussing experiences that might compromise official versions of events. Healing becoming component of larger information control systems that ensured even victims of institutional violence remained loyal to organizations that had placed them in harm's way for purposes they were not permitted to fully understand. The psychological counseling that was provided to traumatized personnel focused on reinforcing loyalty and commitment rather than addressing underlying moral conflicts that might interfere with future operational effectiveness. Therapeutic techniques being deployed in service of institutional rather than individual welfare in ways that transformed healing professions into components of systematic indoctrination that prevented recovery in favor of continued functionality within systems that created trauma they claimed to address. The laboratories that dotted Punk Hazard's frozen wasteland served as monuments to scientific curiosity, divorced from moral constraint, their sterile corridors echoing with screams that had become so routine that research personnel barely registered them as expressions of human suffering rather than simple background noise accompanying legitimate experimental lay procedures. Caesar Clown's transformation from government scientist to independent researcher had been motivated not by ethical concerns about his work, but by frustration with bureaucratic limitations that prevented him from pursuing investigations that required unlimited access to human test subjects. The children who populated his research facilities had been acquired through systematic kidnapping operations that targeted families whose disappearances would attract minimal government attention. Their selection based on genetic profiles that made them suitable for experiments that required subjects whose developing physiology could adapt to modifications that would kill fully mature adults. The gigantification process that served as his primary research focus was designed not to benefit these children, but to create super soldiers whose enhanced size would provide military advantages that could be sold to the highest bidder among world powers seeking technological supremacy. The candy that served as delivery mechanism for his experimental drugs represented perversion of childhood innocence that transformed natural desires for sweetness into addiction pathways that ensured continued cooperation from subjects who might otherwise resist participation in procedures that caused them obvious physical distress. The psychological manipulation involved in using treats as weapons against children revealed sophistication in exploitation techniques that went far beyond simple coercion to encompass systematic destruction of trust relationships that formed foundation of normal human development. The withdrawal symptoms that these children experienced when denied access to their daily doses created forms of suffering that exceeded what most adults could endure. Their small bodies racked by pain that was artificially induced through chemical dependencies that served no medical purpose, except ensuring compliance with research protocols that violated every ethical standard that had been established for protection of vulnerable populations. The medical monitoring that accompanied these experiments documented physical deterioration with clinical precision, while ignoring psychological trauma that was equally devastating. The gigantification treatments that were administered to willing participants produced results that satisfied Caesar's research objectives, while condemning subjects to lives of constant agony as their enlarged bodies struggled to maintain biological functions that had not evolved to operate at such scales. Their enhanced size coming at cost of shortened lifespans and chronic pain that made existence a burden rather than gift. The volunteers who had agreed to these procedures had been systematically deceived about potential consequences through informed consent processes that withheld crucial information about survival rates and quality of life outcomes. The Shinokuni gas that served as Caesar's masterpiece represented weapon of mass destruction that combined his expertise in chemical warfare with sadistic creativity that transformed death into extended torture session, victims being slowly petrified while remaining conscious throughout transformation process that could take hours to complete. The preservation of awareness during this gradual mineralization created psychological horror that exceeded physical suffering, subjects forced to watch their own bodies becoming statues while retaining capacity for thought and sensation. The demonstration of this weapon's effectiveness was conducted using prisoners whose crimes had been fabricated to justify their use as unwilling test subjects, their executions serving dual purposes of eliminating inconvenient witnesses to previous experiments while providing data about weapon performance under combat conditions. The audience that observed these demonstrations consisted of potential purchasers who evaluated mass destruction capabilities with same detached professional interest that other buyers might bring to evaluating conventional military equipment. Vegapunk's research into cyborg enhancement technology represented more sophisticated approach to human modification that achieved similar violations of bodily autonomy through medical procedures that were presented as beneficial. Treatments rather than experimental torture, his patients volunteering for surgeries that would systematically replace organic components with mechanical alternatives whose performance exceeded biological capabilities while eliminating essential aspects of human experience that could not be quantified or replicated through artificial means. The Pacifista project that emerged from this research created armies of artificially enhanced beings whose human consciousness had been systematically suppressed in favor of programming that made them perfectly obedient to government directives, regardless of moral implications of orders. They received their enhanced physical capabilities, serving institutional objectives, while their remaining humanity was gradually eroded through procedures that treated personality and individual identity as obstacles to optimal performance rather than qualities worthy of preservation and respect. Bartholomew Kuma's gradual transformation from revolutionary commander to government weapon provided perfect case study in how medical expertise could be weaponized to destroy individuals who posed political threats through processes that were technically voluntary, but practically coercive. His agreement to undergo progressive cyborgification having been secured through threats against populations whose welfare he valued more than his own autonomy and dignity. The memories that were systematically removed during these procedures represented theft of identity that exceeded physical mutilation to encompass spiritual murder that left body intact while destroying everything that had made existence meaningful. The pain that he experienced during each surgical session was deliberately maintained at levels that ensured full awareness of what was being taken from him, anesthesia being withheld, not for medical reasons, but as psychological torture that enhanced effectiveness of procedures designed to break his will while preserving physical capabilities that served government interests. The medical personnel who performed these operations had been selected specifically for their ability to inflict systematic torture while maintaining professional competence in surgical techniques. Bonnie's forced observation of her father's gradual dehumanization created childhood trauma that would influence her development in ways that no psychological intervention could completely address. Her love for him being weaponized against both of them through procedures that required her presence as emotional leverage, ensuring his continued cooperation with processes that violated every natural instinct for self-preservation. The powerlessness that she experienced while watching him disappear piece by piece created psychological wounds that made normal trust relationships impossible. The Seraphim project that represented the culmination of this research combined cloning technology with genetic modification in ways that created artificial beings whose existence served purely utilitarian purposes, while denying them any recognition as individuals deserving moral consideration. Their enhanced capabilities being developed through experimental procedures that treated them as sophisticated weapons rather than living beings whose consciousness and capacity for suffering created ethical obligations that any moral system should acknowledge and protect. The DNA samples that were required for this project had been obtained through systematic violation of privacy and bodily autonomy that affected individuals who had never consented to their genetic material being used for purposes they could not have anticipated, their biological inheritance becoming raw material for experiments that would create beings whose existence mockery their original identities while serving interests that contradicted everything they had valued during their lives. The Vinsmoke scientific program represented privatized approach to human enhancement that achieved similar results through family structures that were systematically corrupted to serve research objectives. Judge's treatment of his own children as experimental subjects, demonstrating how completely scientific curiosity could override natural parental instincts when supported by philosophical frameworks that reduced human worth to measurable capabilities that could be enhanced through technological intervention. The genetic modifications that were performed on his sons eliminated natural emotional responses that interfered with combat effectiveness, while preserving intellectual capabilities that made them valuable as military assets. Their childhood being systematically stolen through procedures that prevented normal psychological development in favor of programming that served strategic rather than personal objectives. The surgical techniques that achieved these results required medical expertise that had been developed through experiments on unwilling subjects whose suffering provided data necessary for refining procedures. Sanji's survival of these modifications with intact emotional capacity was treated not as evidence that empathy was valuable human quality worth preserving, but as systematic failure that required correction through additional interventions that might achieve more complete suppression of traits that his father considered weaknesses rather than strengths. The abuse that he suffered during childhood was justified through scientific reasoning that portrayed normal human connections as obstacles to optimal performance rather than sources of meaning that made existence worthwhile. The raid suit technology that emerged from this research provided enhanced capabilities at cost of psychological changes that gradually eliminated users' capacity for independent moral reasoning, the convenience and power that it offered, serving as temptation that could gradually erode individual identity through repeated use that created dependencies similar to drug addiction. The safeguards that might have prevented such corruption were deliberately omitted from design specifications that prioritized military effectiveness over user welfare. The clone army that represented Judge's ultimate achievement consisted of beings whose consciousness had been artificially limited to prevent development of individual identity that might interfere with their function as disposable military assets, their enhanced physical capabilities being combined with psychological conditioning that made questioning orders literally impossible rather than merely discouraged. The facilities that produced these soldiers treated human life as manufacturing process that could be optimized for efficiency and cost-effectiveness. The marriage alliance that Judge arranged with Big Mom was motivated not by desire for his son's happiness, but by strategic calculation that such connection would provide access to resources and territory that could support expansion. Of his enhancement programs, Sanji's individual preferences being treated as irrelevant complications rather than legitimate concerns that deserved consideration in planning that would affect his entire future existence and opportunities for personal fulfillment. The wedding ceremony that served as cover for assassination plot demonstrated how completely family bonds could be corrupted when subordinated to scientific and political objectives that reduced individual humans to components in larger systems. The celebration of unity becoming theater for betrayal that would have eliminated entire bloodlines whose genetic heritage might have interfered with Judge's vision of genetically optimized future that had no place for natural human variation. The liberation that came when these various programs were exposed and disrupted provided temporary relief from systematic abuse that had affected thousands of victims. But the psychological and physical damage that had been inflicted could not be reversed through simple cessation of harmful activities. Recovery, requiring therapeutic interventions that addressed trauma, while rebuilding capacity for trust and normal relationships that had been systematically destroyed through experiences that challenged every assumption about human nature and moral responsibility. The broader implications of these research programs extended far beyond their immediate victims to encompass questions about proper limits of scientific inquiry and government authority over individual bodily autonomy, their existence demonstrating how easily noble goals, like advancing medical knowledge and ensuring national security, could be corrupted into justifications for atrocities that violated fundamental principles upon which civilized society claimed to be founded. The shadows that stretch across 800 years of deliberately obscured history conceal atrocities so comprehensive that their revelation would shatter the psychological foundations upon which the current world order depends. The Void Century, representing not merely gap in historical knowledge, but systematic erasure of events whose truth would expose the world government as institution founded upon genocide, betrayal, and the systematic suppression of human potential that threatened to transcend the limitations that those in power required for maintaining their dominance over populations, whose cooperation depended upon ignorance of alternatives. Joy Boy's failure during that lost century represented more than personal tragedy or political defeat. His inability to fulfill promises that had been made to entire civilizations, creating ripple effects that would condemn subsequent generations to suffer consequences of battles they had never been permitted to understand. The advanced civilization that had flourished before his fall possessed technologies and social structures that demonstrated possibilities for human organization that exceeded anything achieved in the centuries that followed. Their destruction representing deliberate choice to maintain systems based on scarcity and competition rather than abundance and cooperation. The ancient weapons that had been created during this prehistoric golden age served purposes that transcended mere military applications, their devastating capabilities having been developed not for conquest, but as desperate responses to threats that exceeded anything the current world had faced. Cosmic or supernatural forces that required planetary defense systems, whose power could reshape continents and command the very forces of nature. The perversion of these tools into instruments of oppression represented tragic irony that transformed humanity's greatest achievements into sources of their greatest suffering. Pluton's blueprint, hidden within the shipwrights of Water 7 for generations, contained knowledge that could revolutionize naval architecture, while simultaneously providing capabilities for destruction that could eliminate entire islands from existence, its creators having understood that some knowledge was too dangerous to preserve without elaborate safeguards that ensured such power could only be accessed by those whose wisdom matched their technical expertise. The decision by Tom and subsequent guardians to protect, rather than utilize these plans, demonstrated moral courage that recognized technology's potential for both creation and annihilation. The ship that would emerge from these designs represented pinnacle of engineering achievement that combined aesthetic beauty with functional perfection, its capabilities extending far beyond conventional warfare to encompass reconstruction and exploration that could open new frontiers for human expansion, while providing protection against existential threats that required responses exceeding normal military capabilities. The materials required for its construction existed only in specific locations that had been carefully selected by original designers who understood geological and metaphysical principles that modern science barely acknowledged. Poseidon's power to command sea kings revealed connections between human consciousness and natural world that suggested evolutionary development toward telepathic communication with species whose intelligence had been systematically underestimated by surface dwellers who measured cognitive capacity according to criteria that reflected their own limitations, rather than objective assessment of mental sophistication that operated according to different principles than human reasoning. Shirahoshi's reluctant inheritance of these abilities created moral dilemmas that exceeded anything faced by previous generations, her gentle nature being fundamentally incompatible with wielding power that could devastate entire oceans, while her innocence made her vulnerable to manipulation by forces that would pervert her capabilities for purposes that contradicted every instinct she possessed about right and wrong. The training that would be required to master such abilities safely involved psychological preparation for responsibilities that no individual should bear alone. The Sea Kings themselves possessed cultural memories that stretched back to the original conflict, their loyalty to Poseidon being based not on instinctive obedience, but on understanding of historical context that made cooperation necessary for preventing repetition of catastrophes that had nearly destroyed all life in the oceans during previous cycles of human ambition and supernatural intervention. Their apparent absence from surface politics represented strategic withdrawal rather than disinterest, their species having learned that direct involvement in human conflicts inevitably led to exploitation of their power for purposes that served narrow interests rather than planetary welfare. Uranus remained the most mysterious of the ancient weapons, its capabilities being so thoroughly suppressed that even the world government's leadership possessed only fragmentary knowledge about its location and operational parameters. Their fear of its potential being matched only by their desperate need to prevent its discovery by forces that might deploy it against systems that had been constructed specifically to ensure its continued dormancy. The island of Laugh Tale that served as repository for whatever Joy Boy had left behind represented more than simple treasure vault or historical archive. Its very existence challenging assumptions about geography and navigation that suggested technologies for spatial manipulation that exceeded current scientific understanding, while providing sanctuary for knowledge that required protection from forces that would corrupt or destroy information that threatened existing power structures. The One Piece itself appeared to be not material wealth, but revelation so profound that it transformed everyone who encountered it. Gol D. Roger's laughter upon discovery, suggesting recognition of cosmic irony or ultimate truth that recontextualized everything he had believed about reality, purpose, and human potential. The timing issues that prevented him from acting upon this knowledge suggested that some truths could only be applied when historical circumstances provided appropriate contexts for changes that required precise coordination across multiple generations. The will of D that connected individuals across centuries and bloodlines represented genetic or spiritual inheritance that carried both tremendous potential and corresponding responsibility. Those who bore this initial being naturally inclined toward challenging established authority while possessing capabilities that made such challenges genuinely threatening to systems designed to suppress human development beyond acceptable parameters. The persecution that D-carriers faced throughout history demonstrated world government understanding that certain individuals posed existential threats not through their actions but through their very existence as examples of human potential that exceeded limitations that current systems required for maintaining stability. The systematic elimination of these bloodlines represented ongoing genocide that had continued for centuries without interruption. Families being hunted not for crimes they had committed, but for possibilities they represented. The poneglyphs that preserved fragments of true history had been scattered across the world by civilizations that understood their coming destruction, their indestructible nature, ensuring that some record would survive systematic attempts at erasure, while their ancient language created barriers that prevented casual access to information that required serious commitment and scholarly expertise to decode. The locations chosen for these monuments reflected strategic thinking that anticipated future political configurations, while providing clues that could guide worthy successors toward understanding necessary for eventual restoration. The scholars of Ohara, who died protecting this knowledge, understood that their sacrifice was necessary investment in humanity's future, their willingness to face genocide, rather than abandon research demonstrating commitment to truth that transcended self-preservation while providing example for subsequent generations who might face similar choices between personal safety and collective enlightenment. Robin's survival and eventual collaboration with Luffy represented convergence of historical forces that suggested predetermined patterns rather than random coincidence. Her unique ability to read ancient texts, combining with his instinctive opposition to unjust authority, in ways that created possibilities for revelation that neither could achieve independently. Their growing understanding of connected purposes suggested destiny that operated through apparent free will while serving larger patterns that transcended individual choice. The Revolutionary Army, led by Monkey D. Dragon, represented organized response to systematic oppression that had learned from previous failures while developing strategies that could address root causes rather than merely treating symptoms. Their patient work building networks and consciousness that would provide foundation for changes that exceeded simple regime replacement to encompass fundamental transformation of social structures. The connection between Dragon and Luffy suggested that rebellion against unjust authority was a hereditary trait that manifested across generations in different forms. father and son pursuing same ultimate objectives through complementary approaches that combined institutional change with individual inspiration in ways that could address multiple levels of systematic oppression simultaneously. The devil fruits themselves appeared to represent externalization of human desires and fears, made manifest through supernatural mechanisms that suggested reality was more malleable than commonly understood. Consciousness, having power to reshape physical laws through sufficient will and understanding, while creating responsibilities for users who gained abilities that exceeded normal human limitations. The sea's rejection of devil fruit users served as natural check against unlimited power accumulation, while creating vulnerabilities that ensured enhanced individuals remained dependent upon cooperation and support from others. Balance being maintained through systems that prevented any single person from achieving dominance that could corrupt them, while making collective action necessary for addressing challenges that required supernatural intervention. The recycling of powers through death and rebirth created continuities that extended across generations, while allowing abilities to find new hosts whose personalities and moral development might deploy them more wisely than previous users. Evolution occurring through selection processes that favored growth and understanding over mere strength or ambition. The artificial fruits that represented attempts to duplicate these natural phenomena produced inferior results that demonstrated incomplete understanding of principles involved, their side effects and limitations, serving as reminders that some aspects of reality could not be controlled through technological manipulation alone, but required deeper comprehension of forces that operated according to rules that transcended human categories. The approaching convergence of all these historical threads suggested climactic period when suppressed truths would finally emerge into public awareness. Systematic lies would be exposed, and humanity would face choices about future direction that would determine whether cycles of oppression and resistance would continue, or whether genuine transformation could create alternatives that served development rather than control, freedom rather than security, and growth rather than stability that preserved existing inequities at cost of unlimited human potential, that awaited liberation from systems designed to prevent its full expression. And so we reach the end of our journey through One Piece's darkest waters, where the shadows that dance behind Oda's brilliant light reveal truths about human nature that cut deeper than any sword. These moments of horror and despair serve not to diminish the series' hope, but to give weight to the light that heroes like Luffy bring to a world that desperately needs it. In recognizing the depths of cruelty that people can inflict upon one another, we better understand the precious value of kindness, the courage required for compassion, and the strength needed to choose hope over despair. The rubber boy who punches tyrants and feeds the hungry becomes all the more remarkable when we understand the true scope of darkness he stands against. His laughter rings louder in the face of such suffering. His determination burns brighter against such oppression. Rest now, gentle dreamer, knowing that even in the darkest depths of human imagination, there are those who choose to be lights that guide others home. The nightmares fade, but the dream of freedom sails eternal,